einen schönen guten Abend. Wie ich sag's euch, es ist jetzt 20 Uhr, Mitternacht. Und ich habe gewartet eine Weile, weil ich habe so geplant, um diese Uhrzeit zu machen. Wieso? Weil da sind dann da sind dann die Menschen schon am Schlafen und dann bekomme ich sicher guten Empfang mit dem Internet. Und ja, und so habe ich es geplant. Also Leute, wie ich geplant habe, wenn es noch vielleicht kann es sein, dass es abstürzen wird. Wenn es dann abstürzt, ich werde dann es direkt stoppen und ein Scrub legen. Das ist der letzte Versuch, das ich werde machen, weil das ist schon Tag 5, Klappe 4, dass ich das probiere. Aber ja, wir schauen mal, wie weit wir schaffen. Es sind 4 Chapters. Das ist Chapter 12, 13, 14 und 15 werden wir noch wollten wir machen. Und ja, und das, was ich immer die ganze Zeit so am machen bin, diese Sachen, das bin ich. Weil ich bin so am machen, wer so gerade ist dran. Und deswegen zurzeit einfach nur diesen Charakter. Rubble und Sky habe ich vergessen, aber ich werde schnell noch Rubble reinlegen und wir schauen mal, wie weit wir schaffen. Schauen wir mal, wie es geht. Aber ich weiß, dass Rubble wird beim Part nicht in der Geschichte kommen, wie ihr gehört habt. Beim Dings, da ist ein Monster geworden und so. Und ja, deswegen zurzeit haben wir noch diesen 5 da. Und ja, und ohne Zeit zu verlieren, wir werden gleich starten. Und dieses Mal, ich lasse nicht die Musik zu lang laufen, weil sonst kann es vielleicht dann abstürzen. Ich habe schon bemerkt, dass es war schon auf Gelb gegangen, aber jetzt habe ich etwas zugemacht, jetzt ist es gut. Ich werde danach Spotify dann wegnehmen, dass es nicht stört während der Story. Und ja Leute, ich wünsche euch viel Spaß und wir sehen uns am Ende von alle 4 Chapters. Chapter 12, 13, 14 und 15. Und ja, bis später. Und dazu, ich werde mein Headset ein bisschen leiser legen, sonst ist es für mich zu laut. Bei euch, ihr könnt auch das gleiche machen. Wenn es zu laut ist, könnt ihr einfach euren Geräten leise machen. Weil ich werde Dings auf Full machen, dass ich dann, wenn ich vielleicht etwas laut will, dann kann ich. Dann ja Leute, viel Spaß.
Lockdown, Paw Patrol. Rubble's kennel lurched violently, another powerful slam ricocheting off the inner walls. Zuma jumped backward, confused and terrified, feral instincts screaming at him to run, yet he remained paralyzed in fear. Marshall and Rocky quickly withdrew back into their own kennels as the noise sounded again. Whatever was inside Rubble's den, it was angry and powerful, charging itself into every surface to break free from the prison. The shutter door that acted as the entrance to the kennel would have been an easy option, but it defiled such a simple path. The creature wanted to break out, tear down the walls, and rip its scaffolding to shreds. It wanted entertainment from the destruction, and it cared little for a simple door. Chase could hardly believe what he was hearing, and with every effort in his small body, he pushed back the crippling horror inside and called out to the Labrador, Zuma. Get back. The lab finally came to, snapping back to reality as he shook his head. He quickly turned tail and run, charging away from the kennel and diving into his own. Chase took a few steps back, looking to the door of the tower, mind racing if he could run there in time. Another bang. The kennel's walls began to jut out awkwardly, slightly bending. A lingering feeling began to possess the air around them, a horrific shriek of confusion and terror. Chase's heartbeat increased, its own thumps feeling like punches to the head, his breathing intensifying as his mind fought to keep control of his body. For a moment, his vision seemed to blur, but this time, he knew he wasn't going crazy. The threat was real, and it was finally here. He couldn't abandon his friends, not now. Holding his breath, the shepherd turned and charged as fast as he could to Marshall's kennel. The Dalmatian was cowering in the back of the kennel, keeping his face hidden in his paws as if looking up was a death sentence. Chase entered the kennel swiftly and nearly threw himself against the wall, almost attempting to flatten himself against it. His heart beating like mad, he slowly moved his head, looking out from the firefighter's den. The banging had stopped, and the creature went silent. What was Ferox's malice now? A dog, a human? He thought back to the image Cyrus had slipped him so long ago. He remembered seeing what he only assumed was a normal dog. Only the head was visible in the photo, but it was assumed to be the only part of the body intact. Everything from the neck down was all bone, blood, veins, and muscle. That was what Cyrus had said. Chase couldn't say anything from his view, just the still-standing kennel that had belonged to a now-deceased bulldog. "What's it doing?" Chase muttered to himself, daring to push himself a little farther out. Was the monster truly unable to escape the kennel? Chase, he heard behind him, nearly making him jump. Marshall had picked his head up ever so slightly, exposing his vulnerable blue eyes. "What is that thing?" His voice could barely keep up with his own breaths. The shepherd tried to explain, stay here. I need to contact the ACG. The sentence had barely left his mouth when Chase stopped cold, a realization hitting him like a car on the road. The only way to contact the ACG now was through the special pup tag they had given him. A pup tag which he had thrown aside in the boiler room, along with his only weapon. "Shit," Chase said quietly, darting his eyes around as he cursed himself over and over for discarding the only means of communication he had. He had to get back to Sky, get back and retrieve his gun and tag. He just had to get back to the elevator. "Chase," Marshall quivered, starting to hyperventilate. "Just stay in here," growled the shepherd as he took a step outside the kennel into the rain. The most violent, brutal clanging sound suddenly howled through the air, deafening all four dogs as a metal roof was kicked out, steel bolts and fillings flying off and dropping to the floor like used cigarettes. The rest of Rubble's kennel quickly caved in, crashing to the ground into a large scrap heap as dust filled the air. Chase nearly instantly retracted back into Marshall's den like a fearful turtle. There was a solid moment of silence in the air, nothing but the rain hitting the roofs able to be heard. Swallowing his instincts, Chase crept forward again, peeking outside. From his position, he could see the ruins of the yellow kennel, nothing more than a massive pile of wood and metal. Keeping as low as he could, Chase couldn't take his eyes off the wreckage, too fearful to make the smallest move. A distant hissing sound filled the air of the clearing, which quickly turned into a darker, lower sound that only be described as the growling of a feral bear. Then it stood up. The creature stood on four legs and reared up to its full, terrifying height, no longer bound by the low ceiling of the kennel. It loomed at 7 feet tall, rising high above the kennels as it picked its head up. Chase stood horrified at the sight. The monster's body resembled that of a degloved, four-legged monster. It was composed entirely of a long, thin skeleton, crudely wrapped in bleeding raw muscles and pulsating organs that shone in the wet rain. Blue veins wrapped around its torso, bleeding down its arms and up its neck like netting. Intestine-like organs wrapped down its legs like ribbons as if it had stolen Rubble's insides to build up its body. It was a creature that haunted nightmares, a sentient monster of gore and innards that lurked within the darkness of the mind. Its head was the only vaguely normal feature. It was the head of a shepherd-like dog, only it was torn and shredded along the mouth and around the eye sockets. One of its tall ears was ripped apart, making one wonder if it was merely a skin mask for the grotesque animal that wore it. Chase briefly questioned how a monster that erupted from a bulldog would look like a shepherd, until he remembered that Ferox Malus likely carried the DNA of anyone and everyone it infected, even between different bodies. For all he knew, the face it wore could have belonged to a poor dog that fell victim to the monster a long time ago. It was near impossible to see any trace of rubble in the monster. For all they knew, his organs and innards had been assimilated into Ferox Malus's body, with the rest of Rubble's remains long absorbed within it. Ferox Malus quivered in place for a moment, seemingly twitching as if it was getting accustomed to being exposed again. Chase swore it was a trick of the eyes, but he drew back in horror as intestine-like tentacles began to emit from the monster's back. They writhed like living worms, almost with a mind of their own, tearing out of Ferox Malus like it was bringing out its own limbs. Taking a deep breath of air, Ferox Malus raised its elongated front leg, so thin it couldn't have been more than a few inches in diameter, and planted it down in the mud, its paws built from clumps of muscle mass, with long, razor-like claws jutting out. "Dear God!" Chase could barely whisper as he watched from Marshall's kennel, sounding more like a cry. Taking a few large, slow steps forward, Ferox Malus growled as it turned its head, scanning the clearing, pricking its ears as blood escaped its mouth. Its body emitted sounds as it moved, the paws would scrunch into the ground, tapping its claws like it was impatiently searching for its prey. Its bones almost constantly popped, each movement, each step, radiating the same sound anyone would when cracking their back. The body had an unnatural physicality, lacking skin and being a mere amalgamation of bone and muscle, yet functioning to near perfection. It was no wonder this creature was heavily studied until it escaped. After a moment, it reared back its head, taking in a large gulp of air, then snapped forward, opening its fanged mouth and releasing the most distressing, most inhumane, animalistic roar to ever enter the air. Its screech was loud, cutting into Chase's eardrums and forcing them open, reaching its claws in and gripping his brain. Marshall threw himself under his bed as the scream filled the air and Rocky retracted under his table. Zuma stood in his den wide-eyed, the monster's roar freezing him in place, swirling around him like a tornado of fire. The scream Ferox Malus emitted was an unholy combination of several noises, the sounds of people screaming for their lives, old and young, dogs, and cats wailing in agony as they were cornered, and other screams from countless living that would be impossible to label. All victims, all their voices and tongues were stolen away to produce one terrible sound emitted from its maw. And yet, the roar seemed to have an effect on those around it. Chase for a moment felt oddly calm, but he quickly snapped back to reality as he watched the creature. The monster of gore breathed out a feral snarl, then began walking out of view, its long, worm-like tail following behind it. Chase quickly eyed the elevator to the tower, the urge to sprint for it was incredible. Blinking, he realized Ferox Malus had completely left his field of vision, leaving him with Marshall in a storm of terror and uncertainty. Looking back, Chase spotted the small head of a Dalmatian peeking under a bed. "What's happening?" Marshall squeaked, tears flowing down from his eyes. Grimacing, Chase crept over to his friend and tried to speak as softly as he could. "Marshall, do you remember those drills we practiced? Where I would make everyone get under a table and be quiet?" The Dalmatian nodded. "Well, this is what we practiced for," he sighed, trying to hide his own fearfulness. "Hide, and do not come out until I say so." The smaller dog nodded as he further hid under the bed. "Okay." Trying to regain his composure, Chase turned and took a step outside. A pounding thump suddenly sounded, directly above him on the kennel, so abrasive and quick the whole den swayed. The shepherd froze mid-step, turning back to see Marshall about to scream, already opening his mouth. Within a second, Chase jumped across the floor and clamped his paw over the Dalmatian's mouth, suppressing his cry. The sound of something large slowly dragged itself onto the roof above them, scratching its claws along the metal roof, hissing to itself as it gained higher ground. Chase had to nearly suffocate Marshall as he drove his paw into the Dalmatian's mouth. The smaller dog was shaking, losing control of himself, and in one wrong move, he would panic and doom them all. A long, slithering appendage of intestines suddenly escaped from its front leg, dropping down in front of the entrance right before the puppy's eyes. Marshall fell silent, but his eyes went wide, and Chase couldn't help but draw back himself. They stood motionless as the worm-like organ slowly contracted around, briefly grazing over the floor of the kennel. It was recalled shortly after, pulling back up as Ferox Malus drew it back into its body. Unsatisfied, Ferox Malus growled and moved off the kennel, Chase continuing to hold his friend down as they witnessed its legs step down in front of them. It was hunting them. It would not leave the area until every single living creature in the area was ripped apart and consumed. It was unclear just how intelligent it was. Was it truly overlooking its prey in the obvious kennels, or was it merely toying with them? Ferox Malus was a malicious creature, but was it so sadistic it basked in the fear and suffering of others? Chase watched it skulk away, walking off as it went around the back of the tower, its tentacles trailing behind it like bloodied, floating ribbons. The creature was unnaturally fast, its slow moving at the beginning merely being its morning stretch. It moved quick, walking past through clearing in only a few seconds. Chase shuddered at the thought of it running. Now was the ideal time to make a run for it. "I'm going," Chase released Marshall, who collapsed to the floor. Marshall attempted to respond, but he made a small choking noise, then suddenly threw up. The intense terror and confusion had taken control of his stomach from him. "Like I said, hide," the shepherd repeated one last time. Taking a deep breath, Chase walked out of the kennel into the rain, exposing himself in the open. At first, he tried to stay low, walking past each kennel and getting glimpses of the others hiding. He couldn't hear or see Ferox Malus, and all he did hear were distant growls and noises. Moving felt like ages, but the shepherd didn't dare to do anything more than a crouched walk. Even his tail dragging in the mud behind him was making him paranoid, a sudden urge to cough tickling up his throat. Heart beating seemingly louder than the overhead thunder, Chase crawled through the open doors of the elevator. He had to get back to the boiler room, retrieve his gun and radio, and it would all be over. He cursed himself for not seeing it in rubble earlier. Surely there had been some early warning sign that he was not himself? Whatever it had been, it completely flew over the shepherd's head. Careful to not make a sound, he reached a paw out to the buttons. The sound of busting metal filled the air yet again, making Chase jump. He snapped away and looked around fearfully, but he saw nothing. In that instance, the lights of the elevator flickered, before completely going dead, bathing him in darkness. What? The puppy quivered, racing to the buttons and pressing them. The elevator was unresponsive, even as he hit every button he could. "No," he breathed out, beginning to panic, "you bastard." It cut the power and completely blocked off the elevator access. Ferox Malus had actually found the outside breaker box, the hub for all electric systems of the tower, and destroyed it. How in the world did it know to do that? How would it even know what a breaker box was? How would it even have the cognitive understanding to know to destroy it? Chase shuddered as he realized just what kind of creature this was. Ferox Malus was more than any kind of animal the world had ever seen. Its physical ability was terrifying, the power behind its methods of attacking and consuming, the sheer amount of hysteria it caused just from emerging, and its intelligence was just as frightening if not more. It clearly possessed a high cognitive, almost human level of understanding and problem-solving. To deliberately recognize enemy advantages and cut them off, hunting with its dreaded strength, and its ability to hide within bodies as a mere cell. Oddly, it was the perfect creature. A true predator in every sense of the word. Chase frantically looked around, trying to find anywhere to go. He was a sitting duck in the opened, deactivated elevator. All it would take is a passing glance inside to see him. If the monster was truly toying with them, how long until it ended the game, forcing into the kennels and tearing them apart one by one? Without thinking, Chase ran, jumping out of the elevator and running to the nearest kennel. He sprinted into Zuma's kennel, quickly getting against the wall. Ah! Zuma jumped, quickly recoiling. Dude, don't do that. Quiet, snapped the shepherd, motioning for him to shut up. I need to get upstairs. Why? You can't leave us down here. I left, there's a radio in the boiler room. He quickly corrected himself. If I get it back, I can alert the ACG and get them here to contain that thing. So why don't you? Zuma looked around fearfully, hearing the distant sound of growling, and he quickly lowered himself and moved into a corner. Because that thing cut the power. Zuma's eyes went wide. It can do that. Rubble would have known where it was, Chase thought aloud. If that thing came out of him, it probably gained his knowledge in the process. That could be how it knew. Well, now what? The lab protested. Are we just going to die here? No, I have a plan, he reassured. Stay here. I wasn't fucking going anywhere else, Zuma growled, retracting further. Taking a brief look outside, Chase caught a glimpse of what he thought were tentacles disappearing behind some trees. The rain made it difficult to see, and he knew Ferox Malice had no intention of leaving. Slipping outside, he quickly made his way over to Rocky's kennel, trying to ignore the pounding distress in his heart. He tried as hard as he could to show the other dogs he wasn't afraid, yet a part of them wanted to crawl under a bed and hide until all the noises ceased for good. He came to the front of the green kennel and saw that the door had been closed. Looking around fearfully, Chase tapped the door. Rocky, it's me, open the door. No response. Rocky, come on, he hissed, knowing how vulnerable he was out in the open. It's me. After several uncomfortable seconds outside, he heard the mix shuffle up to the door and nose it open. Chase dash he was interrupted as the shepherd wedged his own nose under the door and forced it open, jumping inside. I can't just sit out there forever, you know. Sorry, Rocky lowered his head, then looked out. That thing. What is it? I don't really know. Chase looked over at Rocky's tools, but it's lethal, and pissed off. What are we supposed to do? The mix silently started hyperventilating. We're just puppies. I have a plan, Chase nodded, then turned back to his friend, but I need your help. My help? The shepherd came forward to the mix and sat down in front of him. He suddenly reached out with his front paws and grabbed Rocky's shoulders, pulling him close. Rocky, you need to listen to me. The mix nodded, although uncertain. I don't know anyone better with machines than you, he explained. I need you to go out there. Rocky recoiled. What? It's really simple, Chase assured him, keeping a hold on the mix. I need you to look at the breaker box and find out how we can fix it. We need power back in the tower, it's imperative. There's no one else here who would know how to do something like that. I'd go with you, but two would draw more attention and get us both killed. Go out there, Rocky breathed, with that creature? If you see or hear it, hide, the shepherd explained. Be as quiet as possible. Do not run unless absolutely necessary. Chase didn't want to scare the mix any more than he probably already had been, but running was likely a death sentence. If Ferox Malice was truly as fast as he believed, trying to run from it was not survivable. Rocky stammered, shaking. Get over there, Chase instructed. Look over the breakers. Come back and tell me how you can fix it. Hide if you see or hear anything. Got it? After a moment, Rocky nodded fearfully. I'm counting on you. Chase licked his friend's nose, trying to get his tail wagging, smiling, or anything to ease the mixed breed's fears. The storm surged overhead as Rocky left his kennel. His legs were shaking as he stepped outside into his worst nightmare. Rain, he breathed out, cringing to himself. He was willing to brave the water for the sake of the mission, but he was beyond uncomfortable. It was the worst experience Rocky had ever put himself into. Not only was he walking out into the groping hands of the cold rain, but there was actively a threat lurking outside, seeking to tear him to pieces. A shiver ran through his body as he was already freezing cold. Okay, he breathed to himself, glancing behind him, breaker box. Willing his paws to finally start moving, he crept past Zuma's kennel, wincing as he waded through a puddle that came up to his chest. Horrid memories returned to him the farther he sunk into the mud, creeping up his neck and staining his fur with dirty sludge. Leering static began to leach into his head as he passed the elevator, a distant ringing in his ears as his breathing quickened. Looking around, he didn't see Ferox Malice anywhere. Had it walked off? Shaking his head of the noise and static, Rocky crept behind the tower, keeping an eye out and doing his best to mentally block out the cold. The blades of grass that brushed against his stomach as he passed over were bringing back dark memories, but all he wanted now was to prove that wasn't weak. He barely survived the ACG's brutality. Rocky knew at heart he was the patrol's weakling that had to change. Facing death was not the method he had planned on using. He turned the corner, checking his surroundings. Ferox Malice was again nowhere to be seen, and Rocky raised an eyebrow. Suddenly, his heart sank as a realization hit him, and he slowly looked upwards. He saw nothing but the sky, and he let out a sigh of relief, although anxiety still churned within him. Finally approaching the large breaker box that sat bolted into the wall, the mix could already see sparks flying out of it. With one final look around, Rocky hurried over in front of it and investigated the damage. The box had been smashed inwards, likely from Ferox Malice ramming into it to break it. The damage was minimal but still left the tower powerless. The breakers for the elevator and upper tower were completely destroyed and would have to be entirely replaced. Not all the breakers had been broken, however, as Rocky could see the one labeled Basement Systems was still on a green light. I didn't know we had a basement, he thought aloud, then realized it was likely where Ryder had been building their things all these years. It could be repaired, but he'd need a special tool. The breakers had to be carefully removed, and possibly rewired just for good measure. He needed a particular tool to remove the breakers from the box, a tool he absolutely didn't have. But if Ryder completed most of his builds in the basement, it was a likely location to find the tool. Rocky nodded and turned to head back. The ground suddenly moved from beneath him, making him sway and taking the mix off guard. He stumbled to keep himself standing, his fear returning to him as he was unsure of even moving. A large, fuzzy gopher quickly popped out of the ground, spraying dirt across a small radius. It seemed scared, and Rocky was about to approach it when a large, dirt-covered tentacle suddenly erupted from the ground, nearly grabbing the small rodent. Rocky quickly jumped back in terror as Ferox Malice birthed itself from the ground, hissing as it pulled out its squeezed, contorted body. The gopher ran away as fast as its little legs could carry it, gaining a considerable distance from the monster. Freeing itself from the ground, Ferox Malice lowered down its backside, shuffling its front paws as it lowered its ripped head. In seconds, it suddenly sprang into the air, roaring its demonic scream as it jumped, closing the distance to the gopher in milliseconds. Rocky could hear the rodent cry out as two massive paws were planted in its back, smashing its ribcage and shattering its spine. Angered, the predator loomed over its prey as its skin mask began to peel back, baring its teeth as its jaw unhinged itself. Several thin tentacles shot out of its throat, attacking the gopher and skewering into its body. Overcome with fear, Rocky broke into a sprint, his mind going into override and spiking his flight instinct. All he could hear was the carnage, as the gopher's screams were pulled from its vocal cords and swallowed by the monster. The static in his head seemed to explode, almost fully taking control of him as he ran dangerously close to the creature as he passed. Rocky finally tore back into his kennel, sobbing as he dove inside. Chase quickly shut the door and wrapped the terrified Mix in a hug. They had made progress now, but Ferox Malice wasn't finished with them yet. Lockdown, PAW Patrol. The rain continued to fall, soon overflowing the ground with 2 inches of water and clouds of mud. A haunting shriek was sent through the air and was quickly met with screams of agony as a gopher was ripped to shreds. The commotion attracted Zuma's attention, and he poked his brown muzzle outside his kennel. His body was shaking. He had just spent solid minutes pressed against the back wall of his den when the creature had emerged and began walking. Sticking his nose out in the rain, he fearfully caught sight of Ferox Malice catching a small rodent and eviscerating it. With the predator distracted, Zuma spotted Rocky sprinting back into his kennel. For a moment, the lab felt a flicker of solace knowing his friend was safe, only for it to die away once he realized the inconsistency of that statement. What was truly safe? How long until the monster realized to squat down and peer into the kennels? The doors were merely sheet metal or wood, they wouldn't stand a chance to the creature's might. With shaking breath, he took a glance at Marshall's kennel. The door was wide open, sending a shockwave of alarm through the lab. All it took was one passing glance inside, and Marshall would meet the creature's teeth and claws. He had to move. Watching Ferox Malice grip each individual bone in the rodent and pull it out was a grisly scene, but he needed to watch its movements to know if the coast was clear. After taking a deep breath in a feeble effort to calm himself, he took a step outside, further exposing himself in the open. Wanting to make haste, yet suppress as much noise as possible, he left the limited safety of the kennel and trekked to Marshall's place. Careful not to scare the frail dog, Zuma stuck his head in first, scanning the interior of the firefighter's den until he spotted a tail sticking out from under a bed. "Marshall," he tried to call out, looking around before creeping inside, "are you okay?" No response. Zuma knew he was scared, just as was, but this was no time to panic. As much as he wanted to crawl into a cabinet and hide until the sun returned, he had to help his friends. He didn't trust Chase to take the lead, not in a time like this, and he was already suspecting the shepherd had some skeletons in the closet. "Marshall," he repeated, coming closer, "it's me, Zuma." He tried not to yell, keeping his voice low, despite having no idea how efficient the monster's hearing was. "Come on, please, stay with me." The tail quickly retracted into the bed, and the dog underneath shuffled around. Zuma took another worried look outside as Marshall stuck out his head, so terrified one would think his spots would fall off. "Zuma," he quivered, "is that you?" Of course, the lab turned around. Who else? Chase said that thing can hide inside others. I don't think Chase is a reliable source at the moment. Zuma narrowed his eyes, glancing in the direction of Rocky's kennel where the other dogs were hiding. "But I am, you can talk to me." Marshall was about to say something when a sound met his ears. Zuma heard it as well, a low, layered growl of dozens of voices at once. It was nearby and picked the tiny skeleton into a mess of puzzle pieces for scavenging buzzards. Now its attention was elsewhere, roving the clearing for dogs foolish enough to stray in its path. Zuma couldn't see where it had gone, and he didn't dare leave Marshall's kennel for a better view. He made an attempt to sniff for it, but his sense of smell was blocked by the unending dew the rain carried down. "We're not safe," Zuma concluded, he didn't dare let Marshall in on the fact that they were likely not safe anywhere to begin with. A few kennels down, Chase was trying to calm Rocky back into his senses. The mixed breed was not only drenched in his biggest phobia but had also witnessed the merciless nature of the creature. His heart ached for his friend's distress, yet he felt slight frustration at Rocky's inattentive state. After quickly drying him off, Chase looked down at the cowering mix. "Rocky, come on," the shepherd growled, "get a hold of yourself." An echoing roar sounded from across the clearing, putting Chase on alert as he snapped his attention outside. Flicking his eyes around, he only saw the night shrouded outside and the continuous falling of rain. "Rocky," he said again, turning his ears around to try and tune himself to the direction of the noise. His voice was quickly rising, as severity and dread filled his mind. "Rocky, come on. I need you here and now." He instinctively backed away from the entrance, retreating into the den. He still heard no reply from his friend. The gray dog was still hunched over on his bed, shaking like a child hiding from their horrid family. Impatient, he turned and grabbed Rocky by the shoulders. "Rocky," he snapped as quietly as possible, giving the mix a single, violent shake. The mix blinked at the sudden motion, meeting Chase's gaze with quickened breaths. "You there?" Chase raised an eyebrow. "You alive?" Rocky quickly snapped back to reality, shaking his head and reaching a paw forward to push Chase off him. I'm here. Don't zone out on me." "Hey, next time, you're going out there to witness the most horrible thing in your life," Rocky growled back. "You expect me to be calm with that thing on the prowl? Just tell me how to fix the breakers." The mix sighed and grimaced for a moment. It smashed the box in. "About half of the breakers are damaged. I can fix it, but I'll need time and a special tool." "What kind of tool?" "A dielectric driver. You can't replace breakers without this thing. You need it to hold the connectors open while you insert the new ones," the mix explained, "and given the damage, it's highly likely there's broken wires behind there, meaning I'd get electrocuted if I used anything standard." "It's made out of non-conductive material?" Chase tilted his head. "That's handy dash." Both dogs stopped as sounds emitted from outside. The taps and scratches of plastic were clearly audible, as well as the echoing pounds of a large creature walking. Chase flattened his ears, lowering himself. "It's on one of the kennels." The noise wasn't directly above them, meaning they weren't yet in mortal danger, but how soon until it was? Rocky quickly stepped back. "Chase, I can't fix the box without the driver." "You don't have one," the shepherd argued, appalled at how Rocky didn't possess one if it was so valuable. "Ryder never gave me one," shot back the mix. "In fact, he never let me handle tools like that to begin with. Always just screwdrivers and hammers, never anything actually interesting." "Wait, you said half the breakers," Chase suddenly put together. "What's still working?" The mix shook his head, struggling to remember. I think it was for a basement. Everything in the tower itself is dead, but there's still power underground." "Underground," the shepherd thought aloud. "That includes the boiler room?" "I didn't even know we had a room like that." "Well, we do, and I need to get in there," Chase grimaced, remembering his cardinal mistake of throwing away the ACG's radio and gun. "Do you have any idea where Ryder might have kept one of those tools?" Rocky thought for a moment, looking at the ground until he got an idea. "Probably in his garage with his AV." "We don't have any way of getting in there without power," hissed the police dog. "Well, there has to be a way," Rocky exclaimed in his desperation. "Hold on, I think I have something." Chase stuttered in confusion as Rocky suddenly got up from his position and walked over to his desk in the corner. He started opening several drawers and rifling through them, grunting in agitation when he didn't find what he needed. Chase wanted to ask what he was looking, only for him to quickly dodge items as they were tossed away. Rocky's desk was filled to the brim with junk, as numerous things were tossed to the floor. The shepherd rolled his eyes as screws were dumped, wrenches of various sizes, a blowtorch. Taking another look behind him, Chase swallowed and dared himself to peek outside. The nerves were killing him. The inability to find or sense the threat outside was filling him with paranoia. Quietly moving forward, Chase poked his head out into the rain and frantically looked in all directions, fearing being exposed for even a second would be his death. His eyes finally rested on a startling sight. Ferox Malus was not just standing on top of Zuma's kennel, but leaning its head over, looking through its entrance and scanning the den. Its back tentacles were groping around the structure, seemingly latching itself onto it in the event it would need to climb inside the kennel from upside down. Chase gulped and pulled himself back in. Rocky, it's starting to look in the kennels. He frantically tried to hide the quivering fear in his voice. Whatever you're looking for, find it now. Got it. Rocky gripped a blue roll of paper in his teeth and pulled it out of a cabinet. What is that? Blueprints of the tower, the mix replied, dropping the paper and letting it unroll on the ground. Ryder gave me these when he tasked me with fixing some of the pipes. I guess he never asked for it back. Chase came forward to study the paper. It was a detailed description of the lookout tower, complete with exact measurements and well-documented every single nook and cranny. There, Chase pointed to a small rectangle below the tower diagram. That's the boiler room, that's where I need to go. Hey, what about the vent system? Rocky pointed at a faint network of lines that formed a grid around the tower. The shepherd narrowed his eyes until the lights came on in his head. You're right. Look, there's one that connects to the outside. If we get the covers open, we should be able to get in the tower. Looks like it's just around the tower, noted the mix. We need to get the others. Chase quickly glanced outside, assuming that thing hasn't gotten them. His words were met with a shocked bark from an appalled Mix. What? Don't say things like that. Just get ready to move. With his idea now churning in his head, Chase glanced outside, only to be confused as Ferox Malus was nowhere to be seen. The pouring rain did make it difficult to see, but a creature like that would stand out in the open. Confusingly, the monster was seemingly gone, vanished from eyesight. With small sounds of bewilderment, he pushed himself out farther to get a better look around. Where'd it go? Chase shook his head, slightly fearful but relieved that the coast was clear. Small droplets hit his head, making him remember that he was in the rain. Sighing, he shook his head to get the water off, scattering droplets around him. He was about to walk back inside when something quickly caught his eye, red droplets. In a small radius around him, several drops of red were spread about. Chase narrowed his eyes and looked down at the odd stains, trying to figure out where they could have from. Hey Rocky, are you seeing this? He called back his friend. The Mix turned around, seeing Wadash he quickly stopped, suddenly freezing up and backing away. Chase noted his friend's sudden terror, and gave him a puzzled look. Why are you looking at me like that? Chase - Rocky quivered. There's blood on your head. On my dash, the shepherd repeated, still confused. What? He reached a paw up and slicked back the fur on his head. Bringing his arm back down, he held out his paw in front of him, and nearly choked when he saw his pads covered in crimson red blood. What dash he tried to say, looking to his side back out in the clearing. He quickly spotted Zuma staring at him, eyes also wide with fear and muzzle agape. It was then Chase had a haunting realization. The drops hitting his head weren't rain at all. A wave of terror shot through him as he slowly leaned his head back, looking up at the top of the kennel. Ferox Malus was perched right on top, sitting patiently as it stared down at the powerless dog. The shepherd's heart skipped a beat. No, he took a step back, moving away from the kennel. Rocky came forward. Chase? Get back, the police dog instructed, his voice breaking down. Get back. Ferox Malice steadily planted its front legs into the ground and slunk off the kennel, not taking its eyes off the small shepherd. It watched Chase's horror, his distress, his fear, and basked in every second of it. The sheer terror it pulled from its victims was like a rush of the strongest drug out there. Chase! Zuma howled from across the clearing. Get away! The police dog stumbled backward, panicking as he frantically pushed himself back. The mud was catching him, slowly pulling him into a sinking hindrance that would take his life. The creature before him merely followed steadily, emitting a low hiss as it stared down into him with its torn, beady eyes. It completely towered over Chase, nearly 5 times his size, and possibly even larger. Frantic, Rocky turned back to his things and desperately searched for anything that could help. His eyes raced over every item at his deposal. The vents. Chase called to his friends, use the vents to get in the tower. The mix looked over the objects on the floor and quickly spotted the blowtorch. Heart racing. He grabbed the small tool by its handle and raced to the front door of the kennel. Chase's life was flashing before his eyes as he backed up into the soiled puddles that flooded the clearing, his gaze locked with that of the monster. Rocky raced to the front, then quickly backed up from Ferox Malice's flicking tail, eager to spear through the body of a new victim. Thinking fast, Rocky did the only thing he knew to do. He turned his head to the side and sharply tossed out the tool as hard as he could. The blowtorch sailed under the creature's legs and landed in the mud with a splat. Chase quickly glanced down at it, then realized. As his life depended on it, he grabbed the blowtorch in his teeth, already hearing a snarl from the creature in response. He kicked the valve on the back as far to the right as it would go, held up the torch, prayed to whatever god or gods were watching him, and bit down on the trigger. The clearing of the lookout was suddenly illuminated in a bright glow, burning away the darkness as the fire's a scorching light bit into every dark corner and shone brightly. Zuma and Rocky had to hold up an arm to shield their eyes, having spent too long in the dark of night, as their eyes were well unprepared for the searing bright light that now burned before them. Not even the rain could snuff out the flame, the only thing that would stop it was the limited fuel within it. You weren't usually supposed to turn the gas valve all the way up, as this would cause an unstable flame to continuously emit outwards. Chase himself was nearly blinded from being so close, as the torch was directly carried in his mouth. Ferox Malice immediately stumbled backward and roared out, nearly colliding with Rocky's kennel. It was startled, enraged, constantly snarling and bracing itself as if the fire was about to shoot toward it. Zuma watched in awe as he quickly put it together. Fire, he said to himself, it's afraid of fire. Despite being slightly disoriented, Chase backed up, glancing behind him at the forest. Get to the vents. The creature was fuming, moving left and right as if it was trying to outmaneuver the flame. After a second it bounced forward, swiping its claws in one powerful motion, although they hit nothing. Further angered, it roared out its demented scream, honing in on Chase. Zuma took the opportunity to drag Marshall out and start moving him outside, aiming to reunite with Rocky while the creature was distracted. Its tentacles were spiraling out like erratic worms, its tail flicking in all directions as it set its sights on snuffing out the burning flame before it. The blowtorch had limited fuel, it wouldn't last forever. Taking another look behind him, Chase made a decision in a split second. He turned around and ran, taking the torch with him as he sprinted away into the trees. With what little remained of his light, he had to draw the monster away, even for a few seconds. He briefly heard Marshall's call as he ran, tearing across the wet grass toward the trees. A snarl sounded behind him as Ferox Malice quickly caught up with him, closing the distance between them in mere seconds. It spread its claws and dove them toward Chase's body. The shepherd quickly whipped around, thrusting the burning fire and waving it around. The monster of gore screeched out in response, drawing its claws back and stumbling. Chase turned and ran again, He knew he couldn't outrun it, but the torch would give him just enough to bite it back. However, the flame was dying fast, and how long until Ferox Malus bit the bullet and entirely powered through the fire? Adrenaline coursing through him, Chase charged through the bushes and entered the forest. Ferox Malus growled, then looked up at tall, towering oak trees. Connecting the dots in its head, it sprang up and latched its claws into a tree, climbing up into its high canopy. If it couldn't take Chase head-on, perhaps it could jump him from above. Go go go! Zuma hurried outside, pushing along a panicked Dalmatian. Where's he going? Marshall worried aloud. It followed him in the forest. Good, maybe he'll keep it there. The two met up with a fearful mixed breed standing outside his kennel. Follow me, there are vents behind the lookout. Rocky flicked his head in the direction. We can use them to get in the tower. What about Chase? Marshall chipped in, turning his weary eyes to the walls of trees. He seems to have made up his mind. Zuma quickly stood in front of him. Let's go. Seizing the opportunity with the creature distracted, the trio of dogs took off through the rain. Rocky quickly ignored the wetness, realizing greater things were at stake, and there was no time to fear something as trivial as water. Zuma continued leading the Dalmatian, almost ready to drag him if it felt like Marshall was about to run after Chase. It was obvious the firefighter didn't fully understand why Zuma distrusted the shepherd, a fact that frustrated the lab, but he promised to explain later when they weren't staring down the eyes of death. Their quick run around the tower ended when they came up behind the structure, briefly passing both the destroyed breaker box and the waterlogged carcass that was once a gopher. The three approached a rectangular vent cover behind the tower, just big enough for a puppy to fit inside. Although, a quick observation revealed there was no way to open the cover. Wait, there's no handle, Zuma realized. How are we supposed to get in? Rocky took a second to wipe the rainwater off his face. We could cut it open, or force it. But Chase took the blowtorch with him. The mix whipped around, baring his teeth. Do you see any other options? I'm just trying to help. Well, try harder. Rocky barked. I have a crowbar in my kennel, somewhere. I was hoping we could be quieter about this, but I guess that's the only way. Straight face. Half a mile away, Chase was running for his life. Sprinting as fast as he could through the wet grass, throwing himself through bushes that drenched him in blinding water every time, navigating around trees that were nearly invisible in the dark of night. One wrong move could be his end. He had never run so fast in his life, and knowing there was an active pursuer on his tail was spiking his anxiety. The only way he could see forward was the light provided by the blowtorch in his mouth, still burning intensely in sparks of fire and ignited propane. However, this also made him a literal beacon, the light visible from at least a mile away to anything that could be following him. He had no plan, no direction, no idea where to run. He could be going in circles and he'd never realize it. Chase continued in his sprint, weaving around a tree and jumping over a log. He glanced behind him for a brief moment, trying to get a read on if Ferox Malus was following him, yet he saw only the infinite void of trees he'd been seeing since he entered the forest. Suddenly, his paws painfully collided with an object he couldn't see, tripping him up and launching the puppy forward. The torch flew out of his mouth and landed some ways away. He fell hard, clipping a tree and bouncing off into a puddle of water. He could barely even make a noise before his world suddenly flipped sideways, complete with an aching sting in his head and paws. Ah! The puppy groaned, twitching for a moment before he opened his eyes. His vision was spinning, water almost went up his nose before he picked his head out of the puddle. Ignoring the pain, Chase hobbled up, his body was a wreck. He looked around, realizing his light source was gone. Where? He felt like a lost duckling, abandoned in unfamiliarity and surrounded by things waiting to kill him. He took a blind step forward, then another, and another, trying to find a direction while stopping to shake the rainwater off. Thunder sounded overhead, almost mockingly, as the sky very briefly lit up with lightning, illuminating his surroundings for a split second. An echoing scream could be heard in the distance, yet the sound bounced off the trees and surrounded Chase. Ferox Malus was nearing fast, and for all the abilities that creature seemed to have, was night vision one of them? He hobbled a few more steps, his paws howling in pain from the fall. After a few seconds, he caught something in the corner of his eye, a burning red light. The blowtorch. Chase perked up, beginning to make his way toward it. Then he stopped. Ferox Malus was a predator, clearly adept at getting what it wanted. Chase gulped, trying to keep his composure as he slowly backed away from the light. When he reached about 6 meters away from the lit torch, the puppy reached down and grabbed a small rock in his mouth. Heart racing, forehead flooding over with rainwater, he took a deep breath and tossed the rock over to the torch. It landed almost in the fire, and for a moment nothing happened, but Chase was unmoving. Suddenly, out of nowhere, Ferox Malus dropped down from the sky, seemingly dislodging itself from the tree it was in. Roaring out its scream, once again forcing Chase to cover his ears as the sound ignited static in his head, the creature smashed its paws into the torch, suffocating it into the water. The light completely died out, waterlogged, and snuffed into nothing. The monster had been waiting. It found the torch early with no dog attached to it. It chose to hide overhead in the cover of the leaves and branches, waiting for its prey to walk over and reclaim the tool. As the creature snarled, brutally driving the tool deep into the mud, Chase quickly turned and snuck away. He wanted to run, but any sound would be his death. Ears flattened, Chase crawled under a log, grimacing as he sunk himself into mud and bugs. The creature had surely realized by now its trap failed, indicated by an agitated hiss. He heard footsteps but was unable to place their direction. He would be found eventually. He had to return to the tower and regroup with his friends. The dirted shepherd was about to step paw outside his cover when he heard a growl behind him, and he quickly retracted further under the log. Shaking in the mud, he had no idea where the creature exactly was, only that it was somewhere behind him. It was just one growl. What did it mean? Was it moving away, or coming closer? Did it truly lose Chase, or was he mere seconds from death? Suddenly, the log above him lurched downward, smashing into Chase's back. HMF-! He suppressed his pained cry, the log already pressuring his spine. It wasn't over. The log was pushed further. Chase bit his tongue as hard as possible to withhold his own screams as he was crushed underneath. If his spine wasn't going to snap, then he was going to be forced into the ground, buried in mud and left to suffocate. Ferox Malus had its paw on top of the log, propping itself up to get a view of its surroundings, trying to locate its prey. Was it truly unaware of Chase's location, or was it executing him, burying him alive in the ground? Chase tried to shift himself to his side, but his body was trapped. He struggled to get a gulp of air in as water began to rise over his nose. His paws and arms were pushed deep into the soil, effectively rooting for his incoming grave. His lungs began to writhe, quivering and pleading for air as the puppy fought to keep his nose up. Jagged wood began to cut into his head, and water leaked into his mouth. The log was forced further, pressing the dog into the ground as he began to be slowly consumed by the darkness. With a final hiss of irritation, Ferox Malus turned, releasing its weight from the log. Chase was milliseconds from suffocating to death when his burden suddenly lifted, his nose shooting out of the mud and desperately inhaling. His life was spared, for now. He struggled against the holding mud, wrangling his arms and legs free from their hold in the ground, shooting out his front legs and gripping whatever solid ground he could find. Finally dragging himself out, he quickly coughed up grime that had slipped down his throat, then took a few deep breaths. His fur was completely slathered in mud and twigs, obscuring his natural colors and making him resemble that of a swamped corpse. His back was in agony from the overhead assault, but he had to return to the others. Looking around fearfully, his muddy ears pricked at another unworldly shriek in the distance behind him. The monster was surely going back, looking to finish Rocky, Zuma, and Marshall if it couldn't have the shepherd. The blowtorch was gone, its comforting light now dead, and so fell the only tool Chase knew of that made the monster even hesitate. Rocky, Chase said to himself, his concern growing as he looked around, trying to find a way out. Marshall. If he was going to get home, he'd need to follow the only indicator he had, Ferox Malice. It was headed back, and if he didn't follow it, he'd be forever lost in the maze of trees. Shaking himself off, which was painful as his spine was still recovering, he mustered up his courage and crept off in the direction of the monster's roar. Straight face. Rocky, come on. Zuma whined as he looked around in worry. I heard its roar, it's coming back. I've never done this before. Okay, the mix shot in reply, trying to carry the heavy crowbar in his mouth. You need to wedge it right under the hinges. Even if I manage that, these things weren't made for puppies. Rocky griped, I don't think I have the strength to rip a vent cover off the wall. Just try. Marshall was pacing back and forth, trudging through the mud as the falling rain hid his distressed tears. Rocky steadied himself and raised up his front half, standing up on his back legs. Walking on 2 instead of 4 legs was an awkward experience, but he needed the height to successfully jam the crowbar in. After a few attempts, he gave a yip of triumph as the tool was wedged in place. Got it. Rocky lowered himself back down, and Zuma quickly came over. We just need to get this thing open, that'll be a group effort. Rocky stood up again, swaying for a moment before the handle of the tool in his teeth. He thought for a moment, then let go and instead grabbed onto the handle with his paws, fearing breaking his teeth from the force. Zuma approached next, standing up as well, gripping the handle with the mix. Marshall, get in here, Zuma called over his shoulder. The Dalmatian looked up wearily. I am not strong enough for that. You're still a third dog, come on. Muttering quietly, Marshall nervously walked over and tried to stand up. He'd done it before, but the rising dread of the circumstances made it difficult to do even the simplest things. After a few seconds, Marshall managed to stand and join the two in holding the tool. All right, pull. Rocky commanded. All 3 dogs pulled the tool with all their might, but the cover didn't budge. They tried 4 times, each attempt containing even more effort than the last, but no matter how much they tried, they simply weren't strong enough. Feroxmalid emerged back in the clearing, slinking through the trees with silenced movement. Its beady eyes scanned its surroundings, noting each and every kennel. Growling slightly, it trudged forward to hunt down the remaining meat. Seconds after it left the trees, Chase's mud-covered head emerged from a bush, hushed and alert. Following the creature was one of the most haunting events of his life, although not as haunting as killing Sky. One snapped twig or rustling shrug would have completely alerted it, leading to an inescapable death. However, Chase had been successful so far, managing to make his way back. He took one paw and crept out of the bushes, watching the creature approach Rocky's kennel and peer inside. The shepherd's heart skipped a beat, immediately fearing for his friend, but Ferox Malice merely turned its head away, going to another den. They had followed Chase's words, likely all at the vent right now, perhaps even far away in safety if they had opened it long ago. Creeping through the darkness, Chase kept a far distance from the monster, using his muddied appearance as camouflage as he made his way behind the tower. It's no use. Rocky panicked as he gave the crowbar another hopeless tug. We're going to die, Marshall paced. Okay, I'm in charge now, Zuma growled, turning to the others, follow me. The Dalmatian suddenly jumped in the air in surprise. Hawk. The other two quickly turned their heads, wide-eyed at their friend's outburst. Both the mix and lab froze aghast at the sight of the creature before them, a creature caked in blood and mud. Quiet. Chase insisted, looking around. It's here, I couldn't keep it in the forest. Marshall fell backward, sticking all four legs straight in the air as he laid with a shocked expression. Rocky blinked, shaking his head. Chase, is that you? What the hell happened to you? Zuma exclaimed at the shepherd's grisly appearance. I narrowly escaped death, that's what happened. Chase replied hastily, it's still in the clearing, but I'm pretty sure it just heard Marshall. We need to get that cover off. We can't. Rocky protested, we're not strong enough. Oh, for God's sake. Chase snarled, flattening his ears at his friend's hopelessness. We're all about to be dead in 4 seconds and you just give up? The shepherd quickly shouldered past the Labrador, standing up and gripping the tool. All 4 of us should be more than enough. Rocky and Marshall quickly moved to grab the tool once again, but Zuma hesitated for a brief moment. He was happy to see his friend alive, but deep down, a part of him had been hoping Chase had run to his death in the forest. Shaking the thoughts away, he quickly came up behind and joined in the group effort. Now. Chase gave the command. The 4 of them lurched back, putting in every amount of effort they had. There was no greater motivation than knowing that failing to do this one thing would result in the complete extinction of the Paw Patrol. As if by some miracle, the vent cover broke under the pressure, snapping from the hinges and falling to the wet soil. Screws and broken bolts were flung into the air, landing in the water like little drops of metal. The vent was now open, revealing a dark, hot, narrow corridor that led into the inner workings of the lookout. We did it! Rocky exclaimed. Go! Chase turned to them, get inside, I'll follow. The shepherd quickly helped Rocky inside, pushing him in, then turned to Marshall and helped him as well. He turned to Zuma, holding out his paw as a way of offering a boost. Zuma merely stared at the shepherd for a brief second, a blank look on his face. Chase frowned, lowering his paw slightly. The lab suddenly walked forward, pushing past Chase as he climbed into the vent on his own, rejecting Chase's assistance. While slightly perturbed, the muddied police dog thought nothing of it and jumped into the vent. Ferox Malice had been searching a blue kennel when it heard the Dalmatian's scream. It picked its head up, standing at a firm 7 feet tall as it arched its torn ears, trying to narrow on the sound. Its tentacles danced in the air, tasting for sounds and smells it could pick up on. It stood still like an antenna and was close to relaxing as nothing else met its ears. Then the vent cover fell. The sharp, unmistakable sound of tearing metal rang out well within its hearing. Snarling, Ferox Malice bared its teeth as it narrowed in on the sound. After a few moments, it turned its head in the direction of the tower. The sound had come from behind it. Getting down low, the creature began to silently stalk its way over, its thin tail flicking behind it. Lockdown, Paw Patrol. It would be a nightmare for anyone to suddenly become enclosed in a dark, humid corridor that was only 2 feet tall. With little to no breathing room, crawling in the vents was a claustrophobe's personal hell. It's moments like this I wish I was a cat, Marshall whispered, slowly creeping along. What, why? Zuma asked from behind, the kitten catastrophe crew gives us enough trouble as is. Yeah, but at least I'd be able to see in the dark, the Dalmatian grumbled. Chase gently barked from the back of the line, how's it going up there, Rocky? I can't see 2 feet in front of me, the mix replied, if there's a sudden drop, I'm dead. Zuma could be heard grunting in discomfort. He was unable to stand up straight due to the low ceiling, forcing him to either awkward crouch or keep his head low, both options resulting in soreness of the body. It's so hot in here, Marshall inquired as he shuffled along. In the beginning, the vents were cozy and warm, as the dogs were finally getting out of the freezing rain. However, that got old fast, as the heat only increased to unbearable conditions. Would you prefer being outside with Ferox Malice? Chase fired back, slightly agitated. The lab in the middle raised an eyebrow, looking back slightly. It has a name? Yeah, didn't I mention that a few hours ago back in the tower? Well, you did kill Sky, so we were probably a little distracted, Zuma bit back. Rocky's ears perked up as he remembered something. Wait, that's right, you said Sky was the one infected. Then why did it come out of rubble? Chase stuttered as his heart skipped a beat. They were starting to catch on to his lie, and he grew uneasy as his excuses became less and less convincing. Yes, she was, he said quickly, but it probably jumped bodies. It can do that. Jump bodies? Zuma asked as he continued trekking through the darkness. How? I don't know, the shepherd snapped. It's a fucking giant biological monster. How am I supposed to know its fine details? Okay, sheesh, the lab waved off. I just thought maybe you would know. Zuma quickly diffused the situation, but his suspicions were ever increasing. A chilling voice in the back of his head was telling him Chase wasn't being entirely truthful. We've been in these vents for a long time, Marshall heaved. It's really hot, shouldn't we have been in the tower by now? Rocky spoke up. I saw on the blueprints, it's actually a pretty big network of ducts. But why? Why do we need such expansive vents if it's just one tower with just one top floor? It isn't, Chase replied from behind. There's the boiler room down below, and the breaker box had labels for a basement. Shouldn't Ryder have told us all this was here? That's what I'm thinking too. Actually, Chase flattened his ears, looking to the ground. Rocky suddenly stopped, causing them all to bump into each other as the movement halted. Ow, the shepherd rubbed his nose as it collided with Zuma's tail. Rocky, what the hell? I see light, the mix exclaimed. Sure enough, the dark interior slowly illuminated as they sped forward, revealing each dog as they approached the source of light. The mix, being in front, walked up to what he assumed was an accessible vent cover that would lead them inside, but tilted his head in confusion when it was something completely different. What is it? Zuma tried to stick his head out to the side for a better view but grunted as he hit it against the metal wall by accident. The narrow corridors of the vents were getting increasingly uncomfortable. It's a ladder? Rocky sniffed. It leads down. A ladder? Chase spoke up. Why is there a ladder in a vent system? Maybe it was for the construction workers, Marshall shrugged, like when they were building it. I'm sure Rubble would have known. Well, if there's light coming from the bottom, I say we go, Shepherd nodded. Wait a minute, Zuma turned around to face Chase, which was difficult in the enclosed space. We don't know what's down there. What if we end up trapping ourselves down there with no way out? There is a way out though, Marshall inquired. There's a ladder. Zuma growled in frustration. Okay fine, but what if that's the only way out? If Ferox Malice dash he made air quotes with his paws, comes down here, we'll be sitting ducks. I say we keep moving on this path. Chase narrowed his eyes, meeting Zuma's attitude with the same intensity. Zuma, clearly there's power down there. Where else would the light be coming from? There could even be supplies down there to help us. I agree, Rocky turned back. I'm with Chase on this. The lab turned to face Rocky, flashing him a look, then quickly looked to Marshall. Well Marshall, what do you vote on? Vote, the Dalmatian said in an anxious tone. Why does it have to come down to me? Zuma, you can't just put Marshall in the middle like that, Chase defended his friend. No, it's fine, the firefighter gave a shaky breath. Let's take the ladder. Rocky nodded in confirmation as Chase slightly glowed in victory. Zuma had to put his head down low so no one would see him quietly snarling in agitation. The mix carefully aligned his paws into the ladder and climbed down to the best of his ability. He was expecting a difficult climb, as dogs weren't built to use ladders in the way humans did, but then he came to an interesting discovery. "Hey, it's slanted," Rocky piped up as he climbed down. "That makes this easier." "Wait, really?" Zuma asked in confusion. "Yeah, I'm guessing the tower was built by construction dogs," the mix chuckled, "like rubble." "But wouldn't they have taken the ladder out after the tower was done?" Zuma asked aloud. "That thing is bolted into the wall. It's almost like they expected dogs in the vents to be a normal occurrence." "This tower is confusing," Marshall muttered as he watched Rocky make it down and walk away, and he took his turn to climb onto the ladder. "Maybe they're like maintenance vents? We're supposed to climb in them to fix things?" "No, if they were, we certainly would have been using them in the several years we've lived here." The lab shook his head. "Why are there entire secret passageways under our tower? And why did Ryder never tell us?" Chase added in. Zuma turned around again, this time holding gaze on the shepherd. Chase held his ground, sitting back and returning Zuma's look with a stern face. "I've always wanted to do this." Marshall suddenly smiled and gripped his paws on the edges of the ladder. Gently loosening his grip, he quickly dropped, sliding down the ladder in style. Zuma flicked his eyes back, making sure Rocky and Marshall were out of earshot, then he turned back to Chase. "You know, it's really upsetting me how much you're pinning Ryder as dishonest," he began. Chase merely shrugged off Zuma's protest. "Do you have any other explanations?" His fur bristled a little. "I'm just trying to see all possible angles, and it's certainly upsetting me how much attitude you keep putting in." Zuma bit back a snarl, fighting to keep his claws sheathed. "Chase," he said calmly, "what's your problem?" "What's yours?" The shepherd dodged the question. "I'm trying to lead here." "Didn't you almost die?" The lab raised an eyebrow. "I'm not so sure your sanity is intact, given everything that's happened." "Excuse me?" Chase flattened his ears, offended. "I'm just being honest." Zuma held his ground. "Maybe someone else should lead for a change. The police dog stood up slightly, his head pressing into the low ceiling. "You don't get to make that decision." "Says who?" Zuma challenged, fur beginning to bristle as well. The shepherd fully bared his teeth. "Says me." "Guys?" Marshall's voice echoed from below. "You coming down?" Zuma stood, neck leaned back as he absorbed Chase's hostile response. For a moment, he felt himself unhinging, as his own feral instinct screamed to defend himself. It was only at the sound of Marshall's voice that he shook his head, calming himself down. He sighed and turned toward the ladder, climbing onto it as Chase watched him with narrowed eyes. Before he descended, however, he turned to Chase a final time. "We are not done," he growled, then slid down in the same fashion as Marshall. The shepherd bristled quietly. Zuma was becoming defiant, something he understood but couldn't let slide. It wasn't the lab's fault he didn't understand why Sky was killed, or why they were put on lockdown, or now being shoved through a cramped vent. Chase sighed. All the hostility was making him exhausted. In time, Zuma would come to understand, he had to. As much as they were butting heads now, Chase still loved the lab as a brother just as much as he did the others. As Zuma vanished, Chase took his turn and climbed down the ladder. Reaching the bottom, Chase dropped into a small room. "Where are we?" Rocky asked, looking around. The room was tiled with dirty white flooring, the walls lined with cracked drywall that reeked of mold and water damage. There was only one door installed in the wall opposite the ladder, meaning they weren't trapped, and Chase could feel victorious over Zuma yet again. Rocky nudged the door with his paw, but it only opened a few inches before it hit a mystery object that had been placed in front of it, blocking them in. It seemed hopeless at first, but Rocky noted that a strong enough push could likely knock the object away and get them through. "This door leads out, we just need a good push," he announced to the team, then spotted a large object covered by a sheet. Metal gas canisters sat in one corner by the door, presumably carrying either propane or straight gasoline. Zuma walked over and examined them, seemingly turning the gears in his head. A knocked-over chair was lying on the floor by a wall, possibly meant for a more formal location before it was bumped to the ground. The walls themselves were covered in draping wires and metal pipes, all slithering along the wall and turning into the ceiling. Chase wandered over to an overturned box in another corner of the room. Spilled out on the floor were various pieces of old tech, mainly consisting of broken wires and what he assumed were pieces of pup packs. After rifling through the pieces, he came across 2 small radio tags, complete with clips to attach them to a collar. Chase recognized them as unused pup tags, missing the emblems that would be pasted on their front. "These should come in handy," he nodded to himself. "What is this, some kind of supply room?" Marshall wondered. "Guys," Rocky called, "there's a computer in here." All 3 heads turned at the mix, who was gleefully gripping a sheet in his teeth and pulling it off, revealing a large table and computer set against the wall. It wasn't flashy, recent technology, but certainly not entirely old. It consisted of a flat monitor, with long cords running both into the wall and into a control pad before it, in the place of what would be a keyboard. Chase quickly walked to the other side of the room where the chair stood, and grabbed it by its leg, and dragged it over. With Marshall's help, they stood it up and pushed it to the table, where Rocky jumped up on it for a better view of the screen. "This is awesome," Rocky wiggled in the seat. "I've never been allowed on furniture before." "The screen, Rocky," Chase reminded him with an exasperated tone, "the screen." "Oh, sorry." The mix looked forward at the computer screen, placing his paws on the table, and he was hit with a wave of confusion. "What kind of computer is this?" He tilted his head. "And where's the mouse?" The screen was pitch black, likely not on, but if the lights were on down there, then surely the computer had power also. The control pad resembled a keyboard but was completely different from anything he had ever seen. The pad itself consisted of several buttons, none of which were labeled with letters, but symbols. The only recognizable set of keys were the arrow keys off to the right. Looking down at the buttons, they were labeled with small, red squares on the surfaces, each one with a different number on it from 1 to 20. "What is it?" Marshall asked from below. "I'm not sure yet." "Let me see." Chase stood up on his back legs, trying to climb on the chair. "There's a red button on the far left," Rocky noted it, scanning the odd keyboard. "I'm not really sure what any of this does." As his curiosity took over, Rocky reached forward and pressed a random button. The screen flickered to life, revealing a large, linear map consisting of lines and narrow passageways. Several squares were dotted around it, likely key points of interest Rocky struggled to understand. "Wait a second," he started, going wide-eyed. "This is a map of the vents." "Really?" Chase exclaimed, then jumped up on the chair, shoving forward to get his own look and nearly knocking off Rocky in the process. "Does it say how we can get out of here?" Zuma asked from below. Rocky stumbled as Chase pushed into the chair. "I'm not sure, none of this is really labeled." Except that, Chase pointed at the bottom of the screen, revealing a path that deviated from the main route and ended in a star symbol. "I'm guessing that's where we are." If that's us," Rocky narrowed his eyes, moving his paw along the map, "then this must be the route we just took. See? It starts from a dead end, that must be the outside." "Well, then what's all this?" The shepherd leaned back, taking in the full of map of winding corridors and pathways that seemed to stretch for dozens of yards around them. "Why does the tower need all this?" "Your guess is as good as mine," shrugged the eco-dog. "I'm still trying to figure out what all these squares mean." Chase took a closer look, squinting his eyes as he stared into the screen, and spied numbers on each of the squares. They're labeled just like the buttons. The mix put his paw to his chin, thinking it over. Looking down at the numbered buttons again, he spotted the button labeled 15. Finding it on the map, the square associated with it was right out by the ladder. Wait, I think I know what this is. Rocky came to a slow realization and hit the button, causing the square to light up on the map. Is it something that can help us? Zuma was heard again. This is a vent locking system, the mix concluded. All the squares are meant to be the areas you can seal off. To drive home at the point, he hit the red button with the outside gate selected, and after a few seconds, all 4 dogs heard a small whirring noise as a hatch fell over the ladder, sealing them in the room. We're safe, the mix barked in elation. Okay, that's cool and all, but why is this thing even here? Marshall looked up the ladder, seeing that the way out was indeed blocked. We can add this to our list of weird things we're finding in the tower. Chase rolled his eyes. Rocky spun around. No, this is a thing I've actually seen before. Vent sealing systems are genuinely common. People use these to prevent mold and mildew buildup. Zuma looked around and noted the green sludge that was crawling down the walls. Wow, I can see how effective it is. His voice was dripping with sarcasm. It hasn't been used in years. What do you expect? The mix said in an unamused tone. Hey, at least with the entrance closed, we're safe down here. Marshall nodded, right? Chase took his own look back at the map, trailing his eyes along the routes when he spotted something he'd wish he hadn't. Nope, he said simply, and pointed his paw. That ladder isn't the only way in. There are other branching paths that lead around us, likely into the other rooms that we're connected to. Connected? The mix glanced at the computer again. Are we in the basement right now? I guess so, Chase nodded. I never knew we even had other floors. The shepherd looked down at Marshall's blue eyes looking up at him. Can't you seal them off as Rocky said? Asked the Dalmatian hopefully. Not these, the shepherd shook his head. These paths either don't have available seals, or they do but can be worked around. So, we're not safe down here, Zuma rolled his eyes. Told you. Chase was getting tired of Lab's quips and whipped his head around to snap at him when a sound rang out that silenced the whole room. All 4 dogs froze when they heard it. Even in their brief moment of solace were they shaking in their fur. Footsteps. Heavy footsteps trudging through the ducts above them. They heard it pass over the ladder. It followed us in, Rocky quivered, stepping down from the chair. Chase followed the sound with his ears, tracking it as Ferox Malice moved above them, traveling deeper into the vents. Fear writhed within him, knowing all the creature had to do was wander into one of those particular paths, and it'd drop right into the basement with them. Not to mention the only possible weapon they had against Ferox Malice outside was being able to see it and know where it was. Now in the dark, tight caverns that were the vents, the entire area was shrouded in darkness. It could only be heard from its footsteps. It was completely invisible within the ducts. It's going to get in, Marshall backed up, one way or another. Rocky remained on the floor when he suddenly stood up. Unless, he swiftly brightened up, we trap it. The shepherd in the chair quickly caught on to his friend's plan, evident by his widened smile. With the gates. Do what? Zuma walked over. Chase gleefully looked back to the computer screen. Ferox Malice just went past us, meaning it's going along here. He trailed a paw down a lower path. If we can somehow lure in between gates and seal them, we can trap it in the vents. That's. The lab looked for something to say, but even he could admit that was a good plan. That's actually genius, but didn't it smash through Rubble's kennel? Couldn't it just break out the same way? We have to try, Chase said with slight desperation. Hopefully we can keep it in long enough before it even realizes it's trapped. It didn't smash through the kennel until it actually figured out it was closed in. Are there any gates close to each other? Marshall asked, a determined expression on his face as he too was getting into it. Well, no, Chase admitted with a grimace, but looking at the map as a whole, if we close off here, and... He eyed around the map, holding a paw up, here, and here, it'll lock up a whole fourth of the area. It won't be a small trap, but a trap regardless. And since they're far apart, Rocky added, it won't realize it's trapped until it's gone down every possible route. Great. Zuma nodded, but how are we going to lure it in? The room was met with silence. Marshall slunk back as Rocky jolted in surprise, Zuma still with his head high. Chase looked down, thinking for a moment as he observed his mud-dried paws. Zuma didn't want any of his friends to risk death again, certainly not after the fiasco in the courtyard. Rocky was destined to prove himself to the others, and as much as his anxiety was holding him back, a part of him was pushing to be the one to enter the darkness. Rocky sighed, all right, I'll dash. I'll go get Chase cut him off, jumping off the chair. Wait, what? The mix looked down at him. Chase, you've been through enough. Marshall recoiled in shock at Chase's volunteering, visibility showing signs of distress. Zuma merely narrowed his eyes, studying Chase's movements. All the more reason for me, the shepherd shrugged, picking up the blank radios from the box. I've tangled against it already, may as well go again. What no, Rocky shook his head, jumping down to him. Chase, I'm not letting you go. Please, don't. Marshall chimed in, hurrying over to the shepherd's side, you don't have to do this. The police dog grimaced, facing Rocky, oh, you'd rather Marshall went? Or you? The mix had to think for a moment, glancing to the side before holding Chase's gaze. I am willing to face Ferox Malice. Rocky, no, Chase shook his head, I'm going, and you'll need this. He slid over the pup tag. These radios are new, just activated them so they should be on a closed channel. I thought all communication was dead. Zuma raised an eyebrow. Hence the closed channel, the police dog pointed out. These radios will work as long as I don't stray too far away from you. How far is too far? Rocky asked as he picked up his radio. The shepherd hesitated, realizing he didn't know the answer. I guess we'll find out. Sighing in resignation, although accepting a possible fate within the dark corridors of the vents, Chase equipped the radio on his collar and walked over to the ladder. Marshall tried yet again to plead him away, tears in his eyes, powerful enough that Chase had to turn away from the Dalmatian to keep his own emotions in check. One look at his closest friend's face and he'd never leave, but it had to be done. With a sick feeling in his stomach, he walked over to the ladder and reached up the steps. Rocky, he began, open the way. The mix sighed, lowering his ears as he made his way back over to the computer, reopening the gate he previously activated over the ladder. With the way open, Chase climbed up, feeling the cool air of the basement die away into heat as he emerged from the ladder and climbed into darkness. You can close the ladder now, he said into his radio. Chase, there's still time, Rocky's voice came through, you don't have to do this. Close it. After a moment of brief silence, a horizontal panel activated, sliding over the ladder and sealing the path. All light in the vents was cut off, but Chase knew he'd be able to navigate with Rocky's help. Now completely separated from his friends, Chase took a deep breath, braced himself, and punched his paw into the wall as hard as he could. The impact sounded like a deafening sound of echoing sheet metal, radiating all throughout the vent system. Sure enough, after a few seconds he could hear the distant sound of movement approaching him. He was locked away in a maze of pitch-black corridors, now actively being hunted by a vicious, unrelenting predator. There was officially no turning back now. All right, he said to himself, let's do this. Lockdown, Paw Patrol. The moist, foul-smelling stench of the inner vents clouded over Chase. His paws stood on bare metal, his dull claws clicking on its surface as he took each step. The only source of light had been sealed off, dooming him to navigate the maze of ducts in pure darkness. He knew Ferox Malice was coming toward him, lured over the noise he emitted from punching the wall. Now he just needed to keep it nearby, no matter how insane it sounded in his head. "Rocky," Chase whispered into his collar, "you have the map. You need to tell me where to go or I'm going to die." "Do you know where the creature is?" The mix's voice came through. The shepherd winced, probably backtracking now. "I can't stay here." Studying the map closely before him, Rocky looked ahead to find a branching path that deviated from the main route. "Can you see a right turn coming up?" "Are you kidding?" "I can't see shit," he hissed as quietly as possible. "I'm totally blind up here." "I don't have any way of tracking your direct movements. Maybe put your paw to the wall or something?" Rolling his eyes, Chase took a deep breath and began his journey into the enclosed hell of a maze. His first few steps were blind. Even after his eyes got used to the darkness, there was still nothing to see. Oddly, Ferox Malice had fallen silent, a revelation that filled him with terror. It was hunting for him just as much as he was. Keeping the tip of his tail pressed against the wall to feel for gaps, he did his best to maintain steady breaths. The ceiling was too low and the walls were too close, each paw step emitting a low echo he prayed couldn't be heard. He took a moment to shake his front paws, trying to fling off the sweat that was pooling from his glands. Chase couldn't imagine sweating directly from his skin like humans did, as that would probably make his situation hundreds of times worse. He suddenly stopped, trying to prick his ears into the darkness for any low noise that could give away an approaching threat. He was met only with the faraway hum of a distant air conditioning unit, and the constant churning of his own breaths. Then he remembered something. Chase hadn't been able to smell Ferox Malice outside due to the rain, but in the ducts things were different. Maybe he'd get different results? Leaning forward, he stuck his nose out and took in 3 good sniffs of his environment. Immediately he cringed back as wafts of unsavory stenches invaded his nose, most notably the wrenching smell of mildew. He couldn't smell Ferox Malice, at least not yet. Hopefully it would come into play later or he would die in this vent. "Go forward," Rocky began. "The first turn you'll hit is a right. Take it." Chase followed the instructions accordingly, keeping his tail gliding along the wall. His heart was pounding, sweat pooling under his paws. Sounds of machinery within the walls churned around him, acting as the faint flickers of sound in the dead environment. He was trying to keep himself focused, but Rocky's comment from earlier was returning to his mind. The mix had asked a harmless question: why did Ferox Malice come out of rubble if Sky was the one announced to be infected? A part of him didn't want to tell the truth, yet his other half demanded he did. At one point he was willing to sew his own muzzle shut so he'd never reveal Sky's murder. It was impossible to pin him. The creature couldn't jump bodies in the way Chase described, but it would be so easy to say it did. No one would ever know, but he would never sleep soundly again. He had to tell them, he had to tell the truth and be done with it. They'd berate him, possibly even attack him, but he deserved it all. A heavy feeling weighed down his stomach, and Chase felt himself wince as sorrow overtook him. "I'm so sorry," he muttered, half to himself. "What?" Rocky came in on the radio. "On nothing," the shepherd shook his head, then felt his tail drop off. "I've reached the turn, heading right." He carefully turned his body in the direction and continued forward. "Directly after, you'll take the left turn coming up." "Affirmative." The shepherd sighed to himself, moving a little faster. He didn't want to spend too much time in here, as the heat was slowly getting to him. Increasingly irritated by his blindness, Chase wished Ryder had installed flashlights into their collars. Although his thoughts turned to the efficiency of such an item, Chase quietly debated to himself whether or not flashlight collars would be practical. He reached the left turn and followed it, breaking away from the path yet again. "All right, Rocky, what now?" "You're about to pass over one of the gates, should be a foot or two ahead of you." Curious, Chase reached a paw forward, feeling along the ground for anything different. Sure enough, his paw glided over an indentation in the floor, the area where the gate would slide up and seal off the area. Rocky continued, "You're going to pass over it, then make a right." On it, Chase replied swiftly and was about to walk over when he suddenly stopped. He froze in position, ears perking up as a faint sound met his ears. It was distant, coming from ahead a little ways away. It was a constant echoing of sheet metal, the exact sound Chase was emitting as he walked through the vent, only it was louder. Tension rising in his fur, Chase took a slow step back, not taking his eyes from the path ahead of him. Leaning his nose forward, he took a deep inhale of the air. Instantly, the stench of rotting meat hit his nose, in addition to the ripe flavor of blood. "Rocky," Chase said, unmoving, "close the gate." "What?" The sound grew louder, the smell became stronger. The echoing noise of a massive animal was no longer a mere tap in the silence, but a booming break that rang throughout. The sound suddenly intensified even more, growing faster and louder as it moved toward him. The gate," Chase stammered as he was slowly overcome with fear. "Rocky, close the dash." A piercing screech tore all throughout the vent system as Ferox Malice rounded the corner ahead, honing on Chase's smell. "Rocky, close the gate," the shepherd cried out, stumbling back. "Close the gate." If there was any source of light in the vents, Chase would have been able to see the terrifying creature grip its arms into the walls, leaning up in a growling snarl. It opened its mouth and screamed out at its prey, vibrating its tentacles in preparation to shoot them forward. The gate closed. It shut quickly, just in time before Ferox Malice was able to lunge. Chase was safe, for now. Even as his life was spared, the shepherd was unable to calm his violent shaking. His tail was shot under his legs, and for a moment he was frozen to the floor. If he wasn't able to get a grip on himself, he'd probably break down crying right then and there. "Chase. Are you okay?" Rocky came in. No response from the shepherd, as he took frantic breaths in an attempt to calm himself. "Chase?" "I'm fine, Rocky," the police dog heaved. "I'm fine." "Oh, thank. We thought it got you, we could hear its roar from all the way down here." "Let's just keep moving." Chase tried to wave off the near-death experience. "We'll have to turn around." Down into the control room, the rest of the pups were facing their own versions of terror. Rocky would have been more than happy to stare down the eyes of death in the vents, but Chase had already wedged himself into the position. The mix was happy to help, but despite being safe in the room, being able to hear Chase potentially getting attacked was riding his anxiety. "Is he okay?" Marshall ran to the mix's side, whining. Rocky turned to face him, trying to calm the quivering in his voice. "He's fine. He just had a run-in." "So where to?" Chase's voice came from the collar. The gray dog struggled to read the map for any possible new routes. "Turn around, make a left. We're just gonna take a long way." Nearby, Zuma was examining the propane tank he found against the wall. He didn't want to tell anyone how much he doubted the plan to trap the creature, even if he was for it in the beginning. However, the small canister of explosive gas had sent another idea forming in his head. He had witnessed in the courtyard that Ferox Malice avoided fire, although he didn't know if open flames actually harmed the creature or just annoyed it. Regardless, the monster showed clear hesitation when Chase had the blowtorch, and that was all the research he needed. As the lab silently made his plans, Rocky was sweating bullets trying to help Chase navigate. "All right, I'm gonna seal the first gate," he said, hitting the button. There should be another one to your left. I'll seal that too, but you need to cross over it first. Wait, how am I going to get out if everything is closed? Chase worried, fearing being trapped for the final minutes of his life. I have a route planned for you. While everyone else was occupied, Marshall approached the door in the room and peered outside. He could see a whole other room, with even more doors and a starting hallway. The basement was bigger than they realized, and the sooner this door was unjammed, the sooner they'd be able to explore. It poked in the Dalmatians' mind how they had an entire wing of the lookout never revealed to them. Grunting a little, Marshall pressed his spotted paw into the door, trying to push it out. His attempt was futile, as whatever was placed in front of it was doing a good job of keeping it closed. Emitting a faint growl, Marshall kneaded his paws into the ground, preparing himself to unjam the door. I've passed over it, you can seal it now, Chase reported in. Oh God, I can hear it behind me, he whimpered, it's trying to come around the other way. Rocky swiftly shut the gate. That makes two, and the third one I can shut right away. This feels too easy. Well, we haven't gotten to the hard part yet, the mix tensed up, actually getting that thing into the trap. I'll just have to lure it by sound. It worked the first time, the shepherd winced, eager to avoid any more confrontation. Zuma turned around. Why can't you just close all the vents at once? I tried that already, the mix grumbled. It only lets me close 4 gates, no more. Maybe it's a power consumption thing. I also had to open the gate above the ladder, so we're vulnerable if that thing decides to come for us. To drive home his point, Zuma noticed wiring that led along the wall from the computer. Before it disappeared into the wall, the wires met in a metal box with a gauge on it, containing a meter that measured the power usage. We have technology activated by barking sounds, but they can't get efficient power generators for a damned vent system, the lab griped. Again, no one's used this thing in years. Rocky was growing more agitated by Zuma's quips. It probably worked fine, but wore down as time went on. The lab emitted a low growl. Lucky us. Rocky, I'm at an intersection. Chase could be heard breathing heavily. The vent path to your. The mix narrowed his eyes, trying to get a read on Chase's direction. Left should be the one I just sealed. Go straight, you'll approach the last one. Moving. Chase, I'm gonna have to open that first gate I closed, Rocky warned him. It only lets me close 4. Yeah, wait, Chase stopped again. Chase? Rocky asked, already boiling with fear. You okay in there? No response. Chase, the mix repeated, voice rising. Marshall stopped and looked over, also carrying an expression of worry as he heard Rocky's tone of voice. Rocky, the shepherd shouted into his collar, close the gate. The mix went on alarm. Which one? The one ahead of me. The mix lunged his paw forward, selected the gate on the computer, and hit the button. For a moment he felt relief, until his heart plunged as he remembered he never opened the first gate. Rocky, what the hell are you doing? Shit, the mix realized, now scrambling on the terminal. Shit. It didn't close. Ferox Malice's layered scream rang out through the vents once more, even louder than last time. Marshall froze up as Zuma whipped around in surprise. Rocky. Moving so fast he almost fell from the chair, Rocky slammed the button to open the first gate, then lunged over to select the new one. In a moment that felt like milliseconds from tragedy, he smacked the red button, and the gate closed. A tense silence filled the room. Chase? Rocky called out, filling with dread at the realization he may have killed his close friend. Are you there? No response. The mix slowly let himself come to a stop, then he gently leaned back in the chair. His eyes filled with tears as he silently sobbed. Chase was gone, massacred in the vents, and it was all Rocky's fault. Marshall stood motionless, face filled with shock as he processed what had just occurred. "No," he said simply, then slowly began to break down. "No." The Dalmatian collapsed to the floor in sobs, shot through the heart from the death of his best friend. His breakdown was watched by Zuma, who seemed unaffected at the loss. "We failed," Rocky breathed out, laying his head down on his paws. "Failed what?" came the voice of a German shepherd. Chase, the mix, shot his head back up, as did Marshall. Yeah, sorry, I just." He took a moment to breathe. "That was really close, I had to catch my bearings." Rocky shook his head, wanting to be angry, but elation quickly flooded his face. "God damn it, dude," he chuckled, "don't do that to us." "Heh, sorry, where to now?" Straight ahead, the eco-dog wiped his face as he turned his gaze back to the map. "All right, hold on. I'm just..." He went silent for a split second. "I'm trying to figure out what direction it's going in." Staring at the linear map of lines and pathways, Rocky tried to narrow in on the creature's location as well. Remembering the last gate he closed, it could only mean Ferox Malus was traveling on an upper pathway. "It went to the right, I think," Chase said a few minutes later. "Isn't that a closed-off path?" "It is, you better move fast. The last gate is all the way down until you hit the end." As Rocky shook away his grief and returned to guiding Chase, Marshall needed a minute before he was able to catch his bearings. After a solid few seconds of sniffles and wiping eyes, the Dalmatian felt embarrassed for acting in such a way. He could already feel Zuma's gaze on him, and the last thing he wanted to do was lose another friend. Sighing, the firefighter made his way back over to the door he was working on. Sitting down to lick his paw, an odd sound suddenly met his ear. Stopping mid-lick, he picked his head, looking around the room for the source of the sound. It was a low buzz, like humming lights, so quiet he almost didn't hear it at all. He didn't want to disturb Zuma, and certainly didn't want to mess up Rocky's focus, so he investigated the odd sound on his own. He approached the wall covered in wires, trying to center in on the low buzz in his ears. "Rocky, I made it to the end," Chase came through. "Do you have a reading on Ferox Malus?" the mix replied. "I don't know, it went quiet," the shepherd worried. "I think it's far away, usually I can hear it crawling toward me." Marshall sniffed the wall, stopping to observe the power gauge attached to the metal box. Gazing into the glass cylinder, he noticed the meter beginning to rise. The little arrow within it was shaking, moving out of the green and into yellow. Rocky?" The Dalmatian tried to get his friend's attention. The buzzing noise grew louder, now grabbing Zuma's ears as well. The room began to steadily brighten, the light bulbs above them starting to intensify. The power was suddenly increasing, supercharging the lights and making them uncomfortable to stare directly at. "What's going on?" Zuma backed up. "What's wrong with the lights?" The bulbs began to flicker on and off, now catching Rocky's attention. "Why are the dash?" An electric explosion blasted out of the wall, shattering into the room as glass shot outward. Marshall screamed and jumped in the air, crying out as glass dug into his side. Zuma tried to block his face, but was hit with a wave of heat and a glass shard stabbing into his arm. Thrown off the chair, Rocky scrambled to his paws. "What the hell was that?" "What was what?" Chase demanded. "I heard the explosion, what was that?" Rocky attempted to respond when the overhead light bulb suddenly popped, spraying the room with glass. Rouge electricity sparked from the broken base, as the room dimmed into darkness. "Rocky," the shepherd shouted, "the gate just closed." "What?" The mix stumbled, defensively holding himself together. "I didn't shut it, though." As Zuma and Marshall scrambled away from the glass that now littered the floor, Rocky jumped back onto the chair to regain control over the vents. He was instead met with a sight that made his stomach drop. The terminal isn't responding, he shouted, pressing every key on the board with no visible effect. It closed every gate at once. The mix stared at the screen in horror. Every single gate was now sealed, far beyond what the system was able to handle. What do you mean? The shepherd demanded. Rocky he went silent for a brief moment. I'm trapped in here. Elsewhere in the vents, Ferox Malice angrily roared, its screech echoing far through the corridors. It was heard clearly by all 4 dogs, making them stop in their tracks. Get me out of here, Chase cried. Rocky, what the hell happened? Zuma barked into chaos. You're the technician, don't you know? The mix scrambled. I think it was a power surge. He shook his head, darting his eyes to find any feasible path Chase could take. Something spiked in the electric systems, and now nothing is working right. He stared forward, realizing Chase was completely trapped in the vents with no way out. How the hell do power surges just randomly happen? Zuma argued with a snarl. Aren't those what surge protectors are for? Rocky, Chase shouted, voice rising in fear. Something must have happened. The panicking mix struggled for an explanation. Either the system just completely conked out on us, or Zuma went wide-eyed, or someone sabotaged us. What? Rocky whipped around. There's no one else down here. You said it yourself, power surges don't just happen out of nowhere. The lab barked, there's something else going on here. Get me out of here. Chase wailed into his collar, I can hear it coming. The mix threw himself back to the computer, hitting every button possible to no avail. The screen was frozen, static cracking into the display and glitching through the map. No matter what Rocky tried, there didn't seem to be anything he could do. Marshall was panicking as well, pacing around Rocky's chair as he overheard the chaos. He wanted to help in any way he could, but his options were limited. Focusing was difficult due to the cuts on his side, leaking down blood from where the glass was shot into him. Even then, he had to think of something. Isn't there anything you can do? The Dalmatian called up. Marshall, I really can't talk right now. Rocky pounded on the keyboard, deciding to go all in and start whacking the controls in a desperate attempt to jumpstart them. Fear stabbing into his mind, Marshall frantically looked around for anything that could help. His eyes locked on a red lever coming from the wall, not inherently visible due to its low position. It had a red, scratched handle, and the port it sat in was outlined in black and yellow. Without thinking, the Dalmatian jumped forward and clamped his teeth into the lever's handle. With no way left to turn, he yanked his head down, pulling the lever as hard as possible. A loud alarm swept through the area, and red lights were activated in the room. In an instant, all power suddenly died from the room. The broken light bulbs stopped sparking, the computer shut down, and even the AC in the wall could be heard shutting off. All electric systems had completely stopped, restarting the system. Huh? Rocky recoiled from the sudden change. Chase? Can you hear me? Yeah, it opened. The shepherd could be heard panting as he ran. I'm headed back. The mix raised an eyebrow. Really? I didn't do anything. He was interrupted as Marshall came to his side, barking up at him. I think I pulled an emergency shutoff of some kind. Zuma recoiled. A shutoff? Wait, that means Rocky narrowed his eyes, processing the information. Not even a second later, he jolted upright, realizing what it meant. Up in the vents, Chase was hurrying as fast as he could. His heart was racing, blood pumping faster than it ever had. Not a single one of their missions had ever been close to the likes of this. He'd seen danger before in Adventure City, but it was merely environmental hazards of falling debris and violent storms. Never before had he stared into the eyes of a monster seeking to end him. He kept his breathing steady, staring into the darkness as he made a left turn. He knew if he stayed at the perimeter of the vents, he'd likely come across the ladder back into the room soon enough. He was minutes away from being reunited with his family, he just had to escape the corridors. This fact slowly soothed him, giving him a moment of relief from the fear, knowing the job was almost done. Chase? Marshall activated an emergency shutoff. Rocky panicked into the collar. Is that how I got out? I guess so, but there's another problem. The mix was audibly hyperventilating. I think all of the gates just opened at once. The shepherd frowned. What do you mean? I don't know, but I think Ferox Malus may be headed straight toward you. Tension quickly flared, and Chase broke into a jog. He knew running would only attract the creature. Breathing quicker, he trained to maintain his composure as he continued forward. It couldn't be long now until he reached the exit. Wham! The sound of a massive object crashing into the vent wall echoed into the puppy and nearly knocked him over. Chase jumped in surprise, smacking his head into the low ceiling. Dazed and disoriented, the shepherd blindly stumbled back into the darkness. He didn't need sight to know what was in front of him. Ferox Malus emerged before him, cutting off his route to the exit. It initially didn't know where Chase was, only where he was going, remembering the hatch it passed over when it followed them inside. Snarling in anger, the monster bared its teeth, punching its arm into the wall in rage. Hearing death before him, Chase turned and ran as fast as he could. Ferox Malus immediately gave pursuit, screeching out as it clawed for him. The creature was hindered by the low ceiling, and couldn't efficiently use its legs to accelerate its speed. Chase was small, able to fully stand up even in the vents, allowing him to break into a sprint. Even then, Chase was unsure if it would be enough, as panic boiled in his blood. As the monster's constant roars filled his ears, he remembered something amidst the chaos. On the map of the vents, there were branching paths that led into the basement, unlike the ladder they had originally passed. Perhaps there was a way out for him after all, and he quickened his pace. Chase, a voice cried through the collar. Where do I go, Rocky? The shepherd pleaded. Tell me where to go. I can't see the map anymore, it's all shut down. Blindly running, Chase had zero ideas of where he was going. A terrifying thought rose in his head that he would die slowly and painfully in the ducts, his body never to be found. Just when he was almost tired out, a sparkle of light met his eyes, and he snapped his attention forward. Up ahead was a long corridor, but it ended in a vent cover. He could easily see light glowing through the slits. He could see his way out, but the violent screeches were getting louder, and the monster was gaining. Chase knew he wouldn't be able to make the last stretch. He'd run as much as he could, but he'd die tired. In what he assumed were the final minutes of his life, he made a desperate decision. He knew a branching path was coming up. He remembered seeing it on the map before he had entered the dark passageways. Rocky, he called, keep talking. What? Just keep talking. Chase barked, swiftly unclipping the collar and holding it in his teeth. Okay, the mix stuttered. Zuma thinks somebody deliberately caused the power surge. There's no other explanation for why it just suddenly happened. Keep talking. The puppy trailed the end of his tail along the wall, feeling for an opening in the wall. Chase, I'm sorry for everything. Rocky cried, I'm not strong. I failed you. I failed the Paw Patrol. I haven't been the dog I should have been. Sure enough, Chase felt his tail slide off, swiftly locating in the darkness where the new path began. Stopping for just a millisecond, Chase flung the collar as hard as he could down the side passageway, then stomped his paw into the floor that led down it. This was it. It was time to figure out if Ferox Malus could see in the dark. Rocky's voice was loudly emitting from the collar. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Chase turned to face his incoming predator, backing up into the original pathway to his freedom. He couldn't outrun it any longer. He could only play the last card he had, tricking it. The pounding sounds of the creature scrambling through the vents narrowed in on him. He heard its jaws open with a fierce hissing sound. Crouching down low, Chase took a final step back, pressing himself into the wall. Screeching in rage, Ferox Malice was only a meter away from his position. He swore he could see the creature's eyes. Its claws reached out to grab its helpless prey, its jagged fangs ready to snap bones. The monster lunged forward. Chase shut his eyes. The sounds of it moving suddenly collided with a wall, as Ferox Malice turned and charged down the new path, following the voice it heard. Its tail barely grazed Chase's nose as it turned, sending a stench of rotten innards into his nostrils. Tears fell from his eyes as he realized he had been spared, and an old song came to his mind. "Why you are my dash," he silently cried, repeating the lyrics he knew. "El lucky star." His voice quivered as he sobbed, hearing the monster move away. It was a song his mother had sung to him years ago, back when he was just an infant puppy in a bed. At that moment, he remembered his mother's voice, gently soothing him as she sang. "I saw you from afar." He wept quietly, turning and making haste for the exit, quickly picking up speed. As he stared into the creature of death and suffering, at the belief he was seconds from being cut down, all he could think of was his mother, T2, lovely eyes he could barely see through his own tears. "Chase" was the final word from Rocky as Ferox Malice slammed its paw onto the collar, smashing it to pieces. Rocky jumped up from his chair, not even caring that his paws landed upon broken glass. Zuma looked over in concern, while Marshall jumped to his own paws, desperate for any update on his friend's status. The mix pushed past both dogs, running toward the jammed door that led further into the basement. Placing his paws against it, he audibly whined to Zuma, "Help me get this door open." "He's dead, Rocky." The lab came to his side. "Let's just take the ladder and go back outside while the creature is still down here." Snarling, the mix whipped his gaze over to the Coast Guard. Baring his teeth, Rocky snarled for the first time in years, "Don't you fucking say that. Now help me." As Rocky helplessly pushed against the door, Zuma leaned back in intimidation. Rolling his eyes, he joined the mix on the door, placing his paws against it. HNNG. Both dogs grunted as they shoved forward all the strength they had. It didn't open the door but cracked it just enough that a puppy could slip through. Rocky wasted no time jumping through, landing in the entirely new room. He didn't even check what was in it, as the mix's eyes shot upward to the ceiling where the ducts could be seen. Whining fearfully, Rocky struggled to remember the vent map, trying to figure out where Chase was. "Rocky." Zuma tried to call him back. "It's not safe." The mix was about to bite back at the comment when he heard footsteps from above. He instantly snapped his attention back to the vents, trying to place the sound. He followed the duct, hastily jogging across the wall and through yet another door, not stopping once to observe his surroundings. He wasted no time nearly throwing himself through it. This door wasn't blocked, so it swiftly knocked open into a dark room littered with metal shelves. The door, upon opening, careened into a pile of boxes and sent them flying. Rocky sprinted into the room when he was suddenly assaulted by a box landing on him. Shaking it off, although dazed, Rocky approached an end of the ducts. There was a vent cover placed on it, seemingly gating off the entrance inside the dark passageways. "Chase," the mix called up into it, leaning forward to sniff the air. The sound of echoing footsteps returned, intense and coming his way. Rocky held his breath, creeping backward in a slow retreat as he feared the worst. The sound became louder and louder, the creature almost hurtling itself toward the vent cover. Breaking into a panic, Rocky turned to run. Suddenly, Chase smashed through the vent cover, completely throwing himself through it as he ruptured out. Rocky had to jump to dodge the now flying cover that was probably made from drywall or plastic. The German Shepherd flew out of the vent, falling into the room as he hit the floor and crashed into the metal shelf. Ow! Chase winced as some papers fell on him. Instantly, the mix jumped in elation. Chase! You're alive! He jumped into the shepherd, throwing his arms around him in a tight hug. I thought you were dead, he cried. I really thought you were gone. Breathing heavily, Chase needed a moment before he registered what was happening. Blinking for a second, he put his own arm around the mix and hugged him tightly. I'm okay, he panted. I'm okay, Rocky, you did a great job. I guess, the mix frowned. Everything went wrong. Chase narrowed his eyes as he gently released himself from Rocky's hold. What actually happened back there? He asked the frightful mix. Why did everything stop working? Rocky shrugged, shaking his head. I don't know. Zuma thinks we were sabotaged. Sabotaged? Who would do that? I don't know, I'm just glad you're alive. The shepherd looked to the floor, trying to put the pieces together in his head. Had someone actually intervened? Why in the world would someone stop them from trapping the creature? Chase's mind fell back on Ferox Malice, and his eyes suddenly widened. Oh no, he shot up. Rocky raised an eyebrow. What? The sound of upward footsteps returned, emitting from far in the vents. Only these footsteps were significantly louder and heavier, and they were moving fast. Get back! Chase barked, jumping into Rocky and tackling him out of the room. The sound of a massive, metal collision slammed out of the vents behind them. The rectangular passageway distorted from the impact, groaning as the metal bent and tore. A long, bloodied arm, vibrating with worm-like tendrils, extended out of the vent opening. It slammed its claws into the outside wall, dragging them across the metal and producing a wretched scraping noise. Go! Chase pushed his friend up. Get back outside. The two puppies sprinted across the room and wedged themselves through the crack in the door, much to the surprise of everyone else. Chase? Zuma recoiled, seeing the shepherd alive yet again. The shepherd had no time to answer as a Dalmatian jumped him, pulling him into a sobbing hug. You're okay. Marshall cried gleefully. The sound of tearing metal screamed out as Ferox Malice ripped apart the vent, birthing itself from the dark cavities and emerging back into the light. No longer hindered by the ceiling, it stood up tall and uncoiled its legs. No time. Chase pushed Marshall off, back outside, now. Zuma was the first to run, jumping for the ladder, clinging onto it as he stumbled to climb up. Chase was going to follow him when his instincts stopped him in his tracks, tilting his ears. He stiffened his body. Zuma, get off the ladder. The lab looked back at him. What? Why dash? He was cut off as Ferox Malice completely smashed through the door, tearing through the wood and sending shavings flying in all directions. The room exploded into chaos as Marshall screamed and Zuma cried out in his own surprise. Swinging its arms to completely break down what was left of the door, Ferox Malice unhinged its jaw and screamed out its roar louder than ever. The sound smacked Zuma off guard, causing him to fall off the ladder. The creature reared forward, screeching violently, and lunged forward with its claws. In one sweeping motion, it slashed both claws in a crossing forward, completely destroying the ladder and cutting off their escape. Chase braced himself as he was assaulted with wood and metal bits. Run, he shouted. All four dogs dove out of the room, running out with no destination in mind. Where are we even going? Marshall cried. We've never been down here. Before Chase could answer, Ferox Malice stuck out of the room, gripping the wall as it spotted the puppies. Snarling, it jumped into the back wall and sprang off it, sailing through the air over their heads. Ah! Rocky skidded to a halt. The creature landed before them, cutting them off yet again. Growling, it reared to its full height and stared down at the puppies. It was pissed off beyond belief, scratching its claws over the floor as its tail flicked in anticipation. Chase instantly got into a defensive stance, flattening his ears and baring his teeth. "Get away," he snarled, wanting to protect his family to the end. "Back off." The other three backed up behind him, Zuma staying far behind while Rocky and Marshall cowered. Ferox Malice cared little for Chase's show of nobility, and bared its teeth to strike. Suddenly, a new voice rang out in the room. "Watch out," shouted someone, their voice was sharp and feminine. Chase looked up to see what looked like a glass bottle sailing over his head, almost in slow motion from his perspective. Before he could register the object, the bottle smashed into the floor before Ferox Malice, exploding into a massive column of fire. The puppies all jumped back in unison, crying out as they were bludgeoned with intense heat. The creature abandoned its attack, screeching in surprise as the flames seared into its exposed flesh. Ferox Malice stumbled backward, madly scraping its claws across the floor as it fell backward, dazed from the blast of fire. Chase hit the ground, struggling to get up as he shook himself back to his senses. His fur felt singed, and the dried mud that still caked him in places was now practically welded to his body. He opened his eyes to see a new dog, small with golden brown fur, helping his friends to their footing. "Who?" He tried to narrow his blurred vision. "Come on." She turned to him. "Follow me." Zuma shook his head. "What?" "Follow me unless you want to die," the new dog snarled, as she ran off through a door in the room. With no other options, Chase looked back at the monster. It had taken the flame directly front and center. It was completely stunned. With no option, he rallied his friends and ran after their savior. They ran for a few minutes before stopping in an old, dusty hallway. Old wires hung down from the ceiling as the dogs caught their breath. As Chase's sight fully recalibrated, he looked back toward the stranger. "Hey," he called to her. "Who are?" He stopped wide-eyed as he instantly recognized her. It was almost baffling to see someone like her in a place like this. Chase stepped back as the dog turned to face him, meeting him with her brown eyes. The shepherd was aghast at the sight of her. "Liberty?" Lockdown, PAW Patrol. In a futile attempt to contain the creature, Chase, Rocky, Marshall, and Zuma banded together to trap Ferox Malice in the vents. They had underestimated its intelligence, however, and the electrical stability of the building, two factors that led to it breaking free from the trap. In their desperate time of need, the last dog anyone thought they'd see suddenly emerged to rescue them, Liberty, their mutual friend from Adventure City. None of the dogs spoke at the sight of her, only the single uttering of her name. Looking around wearily, Liberty took a moment to check behind them, surveying the path in case Ferox Malice was in pursuit. Seeing nothing but the darkness of corridors, she turned back to her friends to address them. "Okay, I know what you're thinking." Zuma butted in. "That doesn't even begin to describe it," he barked, then winced at the volume of his voice, knowing loud sounds were an easy target for the creature. "How did you even get down here?" "It's a long story." Liberty held up her paw in an attempt to reassure him, "but right now "Oh no. Now it was Chase who interrupted. "We've been through enough, and we've already lost 2 members because of all the shit that's been going on for the last week." He flattened his ears, staring down into the smaller dog. "Let me guess, you're working for the ACG, aren't you? Those ruffians?" "Please," she waved off the question, "you think I'd work for savages like them?" Rocky narrowed his eyes. "Well, you did throw an exploding fire bottle a few seconds ago." "They're called Molotov cocktails, Rocky," Liberty shot back. "Exactly, how hell did you get that?" Liberty went silent, flicking her gaze to the side while she kneaded her paws on the ground. It was true that she had a secret, but how to share it with 4 dogs who had clearly seen death was challenging. Chase and Zuma had her cornered, two significantly stronger dogs who were demanding answers from her. Rocky was standing behind, cradling a fearful Marshall, although still not taking his eyes off of the dachshund. Realizing there was no way out, figuratively and literally, she spoke up, "All right, fine. You're right, I was sent here." "I knew it," Zuma growled, baring his teeth. "But not from the ACG." She protested. "I'm on a special assignment from the Archline Foundation," she hastily explained, trying to save himself from being torn to pieces by the larger dogs. "I assume you don't know who they are." "You think we know Jack's hit anything?" Chase hissed, bristling his fur. "Who are they?" Taking a deep breath, Liberty spoke. "Of course, Captain Cyrus wouldn't tell you. They're genetic researchers, hellbent on designing perfect animals or foods," she continued as everyone tilted their heads in confusion. "Recently, they had a breach in one of their facilities. A certain parasitic creature had escaped." Chase recoiled. "You mean Ferox Malus? It came from them?" "Indeed," Liberty nodded. "They're not too happy about it, but they've sent me into Adventure Bay to gather samples." "What do you mean, gather?" Zuma raised an eyebrow. Rubbing her arm uncomfortably, Liberty knew this was the part they weren't going to like. Even though Ferox Malus is out of control, they're taking the opportunity to see how it fares in the wild. "So, they've hired me to investigate its behavior, document whatever it does." "Well, it came out of rubble, you can write that down," Zuma grumbled. "Did it now?" Liberty exclaimed. "That's unfortunate." "Well, technically, it came from sky," Rocky added, "then it jumped bodies into rubble." Chase could be seen visibly freezing up. "It can do that," the small dog sat down. "I don't remember reading that in the files." "Well, it's what Chase said." Rocky was going to say something else when the shepherd suddenly jutted into the conversation. Hey, it's in the past now," he said quickly, visibly nervous. "What matters here and now is staying alive and escaping that thing." Zuma narrowed his eyes, studying Chase. "Hey, wait a minute," the mix began again. "You said you were sent here to gather samples on the creature," he recanted. "But why are you down here in the basement?" Liberty stood up again. "Because I'm investigating the worst case of the infection I've ever seen." "Wouldn't Ferox Malus itself classify as that?" "No," she shook her head. "Believe it or not, there's something even worse down here in the basement." She shuddered as an aura of fear and confusion consumed the room. Before she could say anything else, Chase closed the distance between them and stared into her eyes. "Are you saying there's more?" Liberty took a step back at the sudden violation of personal space. I hate to tell you this, but Ferox Malus may have done something to a certain area of the basement. I gathered what I could and tried to escape, but..." She bristled in frustration. "The exit locked behind me and I can't get it open. I think the power's out." "Yeah, that thing destroyed the fuse box a couple of hours ago," Rocky reported, remembering Ferox Malus's clever method of cutting off the tower's power. "You must have been seconds from getting out before it happened." "Wait a minute, how'd you even get down here in the first place?" Chase suddenly realized, looking Liberty up and down. "And what exit?" "Because we got from the vents." "Ryder's garage," the dachshund replied. "There's a path in the basement that leads us right there. The door was cracked when I came through it, but it closed behind me." Zuma jumped up, calling himself to action. "That's our way out." She just said it's blocked from lack of power." Chase turned to him, then suddenly a realization hit his mind, and he stopped in his tracks. He remembered back when he sent Rocky through the rain to investigate the fuse box, and came back with an interesting revelation. "Wait, Rocky said the power was only gone from the tower," he pointed out. "There's totally power down here. How else did the vent ceiling work?" Everyone sat in silence, trying to comprehend the new information. If the basement was still powered, then why was Liberty blocked from leaving? Every answer they seemed to find only came with more questions. Shaking his head, Chase only cared about the here and now. Liberty's words weren't making any sense, and the shepherd was becoming weary of her presence. All right, Archline spy, he leaned into Liberty with flattened ears, slightly baring his teeth. What are you hiding from us? I'm not hiding anything, she countered him. Nothing you say checks out. Well, then I'm just as confused as you. Can we stop arguing? Zuma protested, that thing is actively looking for us. Rocky spoke up in a fearful voice, he's right, we can't stay here. Thinking for a moment, Chase was irritated by Liberty's infiltration but knew there were other matters at hand. Growling faintly, he looked the small dog up and down. We had a power surge back there, almost got me killed and freed the creature from our trap. You trapped it? Liberty recoiled in surprise. Yeah, until everything messed up completely, the shepherd griped. The surge happened and undid everything. Liberty went wide-eyed, oh. She trailed, contorting a little, that may have been my fault. What? Rocky exclaimed, what did you do? Now it was three dogs glaring daggers into Liberty, who was growing visibly tenser as she spoke. It seemed like she was one accusatory comment from turning tail and running as fast as she could. I went into an electric room and turned up the voltage amount on everything I saw, she confessed. I thought if I created a surge, it would maybe reset the doors. Shaking his head, Rocky spoke up as Chase was already beginning to bare his teeth. It wouldn't. Those doors are electric, sure, but spiking the voltage would just break them, not open them. Liberty was unable to respond as Chase crashed into her, pinning her to the floor. We had it locked down and you let it out? You almost got me killed. Get off me. She protested, trying to wrench her way out of his grasp, but he was leagues stronger than her. The shepherd was writhing, almost ready to tear the smaller dog to pieces. Marshall came to his side in a flash, putting his paws against his friend. Chase, stop, it's gonna hear us. At the Dalmatian's words, he felt himself slightly come back to his senses, but he was beyond angered that Liberty was responsible for their failures. Sighing, he removed his paws from the smaller dog and released her, stepping aside so she could stand. After all we've been through, he muttered to her, everything that happened in the city, you didn't even write or call, and now this? Lowering her head, Liberty felt shame. I'm sorry. I'd like to help you all get out of here. Chase nodded, already regretting his outburst. He stepped aside as Rocky came forward, a question on his mind. You said you were hired by the labs Ferox Malice escaped from, the Mix recanted. By chance, is there anything you know about the monster that could help us? Like what? Liberty tilted her head, like its genetic makeup or something? A way to kill it. It's afraid of fire, Zuma piped up. Everything living thing on Earth is afraid of fire, Chase bickered at the lab, who shot a glare back at him. Liberty thought for a moment, running the math in her head. Despite its lethality, the body itself is actually very vulnerable, she said to the group. Yeah, but we can't fight that thing. Rocky argued, not even all of us at once. We don't need to fight it, Zuma pushed past everyone and came to the center. I've been looking around since we came down here. It clearly reacted to the Molotov and blowtorch, so what if we created some kind of explosion? In the lookout? Chase recoiled at the thought, we can't just destroy our home. There are gas canisters all over the place. The lab pressed his idea, then turned to Liberty. Maybe not an explosion, but if we could create a fire big enough, would that kill it? The dachshund thought for a moment, trying to remember the data she read from the labs. It would have to be complete incineration, with no chance of it escaping. Great, Zuma wagged his tail, happy someone was finally agreeing with him. Let's go find gasoline and block some doors. No. Chase jumped in to face the lab, baring his teeth. Don't you remember the original plan? I need to get in the boiler room. I thought that plan failed, Rocky asked. It never failed, the shepherd hissed. There's a radio in there to contact Captain Cyrus. Once I get it back, this place will be swarming with soldiers and Ferox Malice will be disposed of. Chase, Liberty came to his side. It's not going to be that simple. What do you mean? The police officer raised an eyebrow. Because it's not just Ferox Malice that needs disposing of. Her voice quivered slightly, and a wave of fear went over her. There's something you need to see. The dogs had questions, but Liberty just shook her head and beckoned for them to follow. Rocky followed first with Marshall, although Chase and Zuma were still glaring daggers at one another. Their hostility was silently upsetting Liberty, as she remembered long ago how close they had been as friends. What in the world could be happening between them to break them apart? They were suppressing their words now, but it was easy to tell that the two were growing tenser by the minute. Ferox Malice had fled from the Molotov cocktail, disappearing into the dark corridors of the basement. The walls were nothing but old, peeling white paint with cords and wires dangling from the top, the floors expanding out with dirty black and white tiles. Every few moments, an echoing scream would bounce down the hallways, seemingly coming from nowhere. Marshall jumped at each one, and Chase would emit a low whine. The creature was regrouping, collecting itself elsewhere before it took to the hallways again, stalking down its prey. The group of 5 stopped at every corner, peeking around to make sure they wouldn't accidentally run head-on into danger. Even with Liberty as the newest addition, they were still powerless if Ferox Malice succeeded in hunting them down. So what are you showing us? Zuma whispered as the group got against the wall, moving in single file. Liberty peered through the cracked door, scanning the dark corridor on the other side. All I can say is, do you know how long Ferox Malice has been in Adventure Bay? Chase spoke up, positioned behind the dachshund. I only learned about it a few days ago from Cyrus. My best guess is a few days. Try a week, she responded grimly, grimacing in disgust at what she was seeing through the doorway. An entire week, the shepherd exclaimed. What makes you say that? Shuddering, Liberty backed from the door, turning to her companions as she pointed her paw. Remember when I said there was something even worse in the basement? She was visibly scared, a piece of her not wanting to go through. Go and see for yourself. There was a feeling of dread that washed over the group, a piercing lash of static that infested all 5 dogs at once. She had been addressing Chase, putting him in the position of walking through the door first and charging into whatever was behind it. Usually, the shepherd enjoyed being the one to take leadership, but now he wasn't feeling so sure, and yet he knew no one else would take charge. Putting every ounce of his manpower into moving, Chase began to move forward. I'm going, Rocky suddenly pushed past the shepherd. Chase reared in horror, fearing the mix walking into death. Rocky, wait, let me dash. The eco-dog slowly turned his head, looking Chase directly in the eye. I'm going. His tone was sharp, enough to shut the shepherd up and close his mouth. Taking a deep breath, Rocky walked forward and went through, disappearing through the metal doorway. The 4 dogs listened intently, all frozen in place and fearing to utter even a single word. There were no screams yet, no roars from the creature, and eventually Chase's anxiety completely took over. Rocky? He whispered, creeping his nose along the wall to the door, moving slowly. There was no response, and he couldn't take it anymore. Rocky, are you dash? Chase left the wall and passed under the doorway, following his friend inside. It was like walking into the depths of hell. The first thing he saw was Rocky, standing paralyzed in fear as he quivered in terror, eyes locked upward as he stared out. Chase was about to call his friend when a gruesome sight met his eyes, locking him in place as well. It was unlike anything he had ever seen before, not even anything a simple movie or book could come up with. For all he knew, he had just walked straight into another world. The walls were slathered in slime, glistening in a putrid light. Bulbous, flesh-like masses were growing out of the wall, leaching around the corridor and along the ceiling. It was like walking down a giant human throat, you couldn't even see the edges where the wall and ceiling met, all just wet, veiny, red muscle mass that covered the surface. Translucent sludge dripped down from the ceiling, tapping at the slippery floor that was also undergoing a disgusting transformation. Taking a fearful step into the esophagus that the hallway had been turned into, Chase could barely get a word out. His paw splashed into the warm, sticky slime that was collecting on the tile, a repulsive stench of stomach acid hitting his nose. Tumor-like lumps were dotted around the walls in various sizes, like boils puffing up in one's throat. Most of the overhead lights were obscured, but a weak glow was able to pass through the biomass, providing only a tiny amount of lighting for the puppies to see their way in. What is? He stammered, darting his eyes as the nightmare unfolded before him. He came to Rocky's side, who still hadn't moved. What the hell is all this? What happened down here? Liberty followed in behind him, her face stained with discomfort as she entered the vile corridor. It's a hive. This is what Ferox Malus has been doing for the last week. Zuma and Marshall entered after her, the lab immediately grabbing the Dalmatian and holding him close at the horrible sight before them. Slowly turning around, Chase could feel his sanity breaking. A hive, he repeated in disbelief. That thing has been nesting down here right under our noses? What is all this? Zuma choked. How did it even build all this? I don't know, Liberty confessed, covering her mouth as she was seconds from throwing up. The Archline Foundation didn't mention any behavior even remotely similar to this. This is something new. Quaking inside, Chase stared down the pulsating cavern. We have to go down here, don't we? This is the way to Ryder's garage. I'm going to assume it didn't always look like this, the dachshund hesitantly continued forward. Let's just keep going. With great persuasion, Zuma carefully led Marshall along the terrifying pathway, each step producing a sickening noise as it pressed into the slime below. Every few feet, they passed a new monstrosity to molest their eyes and mind. It wasn't just one room, the horror continued and expanded, transforming the entire other side of the basement into what could only be called Ferox Malus's personal hive. 7 feet in, they came to an intersection, but the left and right paths were completely blocked. Thick, tendon-like strings stretched from the floor to the ceiling, forming a tough barricade barring off passage to the new paths and forcing the route to remain one way. As they passed by, the stings started vibrating for a few seconds, producing a low, layered hum that echoed throughout the living corridors. I hate this, Rocky nervously paced, flinching as slime dripped on his back. Liberty, talk to me, Chase called to the front of the line. Where are we going? The small dog took a moment to respond, over-encumbered by her slowly slipping sanity. I remembered coming into a series of rooms, one of which had the electric systems where I caused the surge. If we're going to find out why the door is sealed, we have to get there first. If we end up actually getting into the garage, I could find a dielectric driver, Rocky inquired, breathing heavily. Then I could fix the breakers, and you could get into the boiler room. Marshall, Chase called behind him, how are you doing back there? Talk to me. Walking as if he was automated, the Dalmatian spoke with a broken voice. He hadn't yet stopped staring at the ground. Chase, I really don't want to talk right now. Looking up from the group, Zuma's eyes briefly centered on the sickly white boils that grew from the wall. With morbid curiosity, he approached the sack, a wet smell he couldn't describe foaming up his nose. Despite every instinct telling him to back away, there was something drawing him towards it. It was massive in size, significantly bigger than the Labrador. Stopping before, Zuma squinted his eyes and stared into the pus-filled tumor, searching for any answer to his sea of questions. I can see things moving in the walls, Rocky breathed. What? Chase fearfully glanced around, panicked that something was looming over them. Like worms, the mix looked up at the ceiling, and a lot of other things. I'm pretty sure those are just normal bugs, Liberty inquired, probably attracted to the hive's atmosphere. Guys. Zuma jumped back. There's a person floating in here. Everyone turned around at once to see the lab recoiling in terror. Before they could say anything, Zuma swiped forward with his dull claws, tearing into the boil. The attack produced a slit in the skin-like casing, then suddenly popped open as liquid flooded out, causing the dogs to rear back in disgust. The casing deflated as it was emptied, and a human woman fell out, landing on her side. Marshall wanted to scream, Chase wanted to howl, and they all were a hair's length from exploding in an uproar of terror. But they couldn't, as much as they wanted to scream, they simply couldn't be at risk of alerting the creature to their location. Wait a minute, Chase narrowed his eyes, walking past Rocky and stepping into the puddle of emptied pus. I think I recognize her. You do? Liberty tilted her head. Lowering his head for a closer look, Chase surveyed the corpse. The woman wasn't mangled, but it was obvious her bones had been broken. A few days ago, we got a call for a missing woman and her pet, he explained. We arrived on the scene, but then the ACG appeared and interrupted us. We never finished the mission. He grimaced, realizing he just solved the case. Well, here she is. A haunting revelation hit the dogs. Every single boil they passed, every writhing sack that grew from the wall, served a purpose. Each and everyone had a victim, be it human or animal, housed inside it. Chase begged for it not to be true, but he approached another bulbous sack sitting off to the right. He could clearly see the silhouette of a dog floating inside. But why is it taking people? Zuma asked in disbelief. I thought it just killed things and ate them. Overhearing the conversation, Liberty walked ahead, not wanting to stare at the body any longer. As she trudged through the slime, which was starting to rise in elevation, she stopped when she spotted something obscured in the darkness. Desperate for anything that would classify as a sample, as Liberty was itching to escape the hellhole she was walking through, he made haste to the object. Perhaps they were some kind of waste? Did Ferox Malice even produce waste to begin with? She thought it was just another boil as she approached it, but as her eyes focused on it she realized it was something completely new. It was an oval-shaped pod, sitting quietly in the peaceful darkness. It was small, not much bigger than her. It was covered in veins and multiple layers of biomass. As Liberty hesitantly pressed her paw to it she found it was warm to the touch. Reluctantly moving her ear to it, she could hear faint sounds inside it, sounds she couldn't describe. It was like gurgling, so quiet and low she could barely make out it was there. Looking around the pod, she realized it wasn't just one. An entire second pod was sitting on its side nearby, and a third was not even 2 feet away. As the dogs behind her cried to one another in distress, Liberty walked further down the passage and stopped when she came to a distressing sight. The path continued, but all along the walls, dozens of pods had been laid. There were clusters of them everywhere. Some were gently floating in the sludge while others sat on top of others. Her eyes went wide as a terrifying revelation hit her, and at that moment all courage within her died away. You mean to tell me every single one of those sacks we passed had someone inside it? Rocky recoiled. How many people are down here? No idea, Chase shook his head, but I don't understand why it would just take people. Why store them all down here? Liberty emerged behind them, her face gone pale. Food, she said simply, they're meant to be food. But why? Zuma looked at her. Why not just eat them then and there? Because it's food for something else, she replied, her voice shaking. It's for the offspring. She shakily turned and pointed at the pods she had found, now extremely fearful of their presence. Ferox Malice is laying eggs.